The first warning came at 5:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, though Walter Bennett would later realize his body had been trying to warn him for months. A dull pressure had settled beneath his ribs while he was unlocking the front door of Bennett Hardware and Supply, the same door he had opened almost every morning for 40 years. He ignored it the way men of his generation ignored most things that hurt: knees, backs, loneliness, especially loneliness. The brass key turned with its familiar heavy click, and the old bell above the door gave a tired jingle that echoed through the darkened store. The smell hit him immediately: cedar lumber, motor oil, fertilizer, and the faint metallic scent of tools that had been handled by generations of mountain families. This place was his life, not the building itself, but what it represented. His father had started the business in 1978 with 2 shelves of nails and a second-hand cash register. Walter and Eleanor had spent their marriage turning it into the kind of store where contractors knew your name, widows got help carrying paint to their cars, and nobody left without a weather forecast and at least one unsolicited piece of advice. Outside, dawn was just beginning to touch the Blue Ridge Mountains with pale gray light. Asheville was still quiet. A delivery truck rumbled somewhere in the distance, and rain from the night before clung to the sidewalks in silver patches. Walter flicked on the front lights 1 row at a time. Click, click, click. The aisles slowly emerged from darkness. He moved more carefully than he used to. Since Eleanor died 2 years earlier, mornings had become the hardest part of the day. The house felt too large, the bed too cold, and the silence too honest. So he came to the store early, long before the employees arrived, because work was easier than remembering. On the counter beside the register sat a framed photograph of Eleanor wearing gardening gloves and laughing at something outside the frame. Walter touched the edge of the photo with 2 fingers. "Morning, Ellie," he murmured. The pressure in his abdomen tightened. He frowned and straightened slowly. Probably the chili from last night. Martha had brought over a casserole, and he had eaten 2 bowls while pretending he wasn't grateful for the company. At 6:03, Luis Herrera, his store manager, came through the back entrance carrying coffee. "You're here before the birds again," Luis said with a grin. "Birds don't have payroll reports." Luis laughed and handed him a cup. "You look tired, Walter. Occupational hazard of owning a hardware store." But as Walter reached for the coffee, his hand trembled slightly. A sharp pain shot through his lower abdomen and wrapped around his back like a tightening belt. Luis noticed immediately. "Hey," he said, setting his own coffee down. "You okay?" Walter forced a smile. "Just stood up too fast." He hated how weak that sounded. Luis wasn't convinced. "You've been rubbing your side for a week. 68 years old, Luis. Something's always rubbing something." He tried to make it a joke, but another wave hit him harder this time. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers and splashed across the counter. Luis stepped forward. "Walter?" "I'm fine." The words came out through clenched teeth. For a moment, the store tilted slightly. Walter grabbed the edge of the counter until the dizziness passed. He could hear his own heartbeat, heavy and irregular, pounding in his ears. Luis's expression changed from concern to alarm. "I'm calling somebody." "No hospitals," Walter snapped automatically. "I've got inventory coming at 8. "Inventory can wait." Walter opened his mouth to argue again, but the pain exploded. It was not the gradual ache he had been dismissing for weeks. This was sudden, violent, tearing. It felt as if something deep inside him had ripped open. He doubled over with a strangled gasp. "Jesus Christ," Luis whispered. Walter tried to straighten, but his legs buckled. He caught himself against a display of paint rollers, sending several packages clattering onto the floor. "Call Daniel," he managed. "Don't call." The sentence ended in a groan as another surge of pain hit. Luis was already pulling out his phone. 911, he said into the receiver, his voice surprisingly steady. "I need an ambulance at Bennett Hardware on Lexington Avenue. My boss is having severe abdominal pain and he's collapsing." Walter hated the word collapsing. He slid down onto an overturned bucket behind the counter, breathing in short, shallow bursts. Sweat soaked through the back of his flannel shirt despite the cool morning air. The dispatcher's voice crackled faintly from Luis's phone. "Is he conscious?" "Yes." "Is he having chest pain?" Walter shook his head violently. "Not my heart," he muttered. "Tell them it's not my heart." The irony would come later. Luis knelt beside him. "Help's coming." Walter's vision blurred around the edges. He focused on Eleanor's photograph across the counter, using it like an anchor. Not today, he thought desperately. Not here. Within minutes, sirens echoed through downtown Asheville. The front door burst open, and two paramedics hurried inside carrying equipment bags. The taller one, a sandy-haired man in his late 20s, dropped beside Walter immediately. "I'm Ethan Cole," he said calmly. "Walter, can you tell me where the pain is?" Walter pointed shakily to his abdomen. Ethan's expression sharpened the instant he saw Walter's gray skin and distended abdomen. "When did this start?" "This morning. Got worse." Ethan checked his pulse, then looked at his partner. That look lasted less than a second, but it was enough for Walter to recognize professional concern. "What is it?" Walter asked. Ethan met his eyes directly. "I think we need to move quickly." They transferred him onto a stretcher. As they lifted him, the pain became so intense that a cry escaped his throat before he could stop it. Humiliation burned almost as sharply as the pain. Customers had not even arrived yet, but the thought of being carried out of his own store like a helpless old man made his stomach twist. Ethan noticed his gaze drifting toward the aisles. "Your store's in good hands," he said quietly. Walter gave a weak snort. "Easy for you to say." As they rolled toward the door, Walter suddenly remembered something. The key. What key? He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the heavy brass front door key, worn smooth by decades of use. "Don't lose this," he whispered to Luis. "My father carried it before me." Luis closed Walter's fingers back around it. "You keep it," he said. "You'll be back to open the store yourself." The ambulance doors slammed shut. Inside, everything became motion and noise. Blood pressure cuff tightening, oxygen mask hissing, Ethan starting an IV with practiced efficiency. Walter tried to stay conscious by watching the city slide past the rear windows. Asheville blurred into streaks of brick buildings, coffee shops, and rain-darkened trees. Ethan looked at the monitor, then at Walter. "Walter, I need you to stay with me. Have you ever had an aneurysm?" "No." "Any sudden severe abdominal pain before today?" "Just aches." Ethan nodded grimly. Walter was not a doctor, but he had spent enough years around construction accidents to recognize the tone of someone who was worried. "How bad is it?" he asked. Ethan hesitated only briefly. "I think you may have a ruptured abdominal aneurysm. If that's what this is, the surgeons need to see you immediately." The words settled over Walter like cold water. Ruptured. Immediate. He thought of Eleanor's funeral, of Daniel as a little boy sweeping sawdust from the store floor with a broom twice his size, of the unfinished paperwork sitting on his desk upstairs, of the tomatoes that still needed staking in the backyard garden. So many ordinary things suddenly felt unbearably precious. Ethan squeezed his shoulder lightly as the ambulance turned into the hospital entrance. "We're almost there." Orderlies were waiting when the doors opened. Bright lights flooded Walter's vision as they rushed him through the emergency entrance. Voices overlapped around him. BP dropping. "Call vascular surgery. Type and cross 4 units. A nurse jogged alongside the stretcher holding a clipboard. "Mr. Bennett, do you have family we can contact?" Walter swallowed hard. "My son," he said. "Daniel Bennett. His number's in my phone. We'll call him right away." Good, Walter thought. Daniel would come. Of course he would come. They pushed through a set of double doors marked "Surgery Authorized Personnel Only." A surgeon in blue scrubs appeared at the foot of the stretcher, scanning the chart with rapid eyes. "CT confirms a ruptured AAA," he said to the team. Then he looked directly at Walter. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Dr. Harris. Your abdominal aorta has ruptured. We need to operate immediately." The ceiling lights passed overhead in a blinding white rhythm. Walter's hand closed instinctively around the brass key still clutched in his palm. "Will my son be here?" he asked. "Doctor." Harris answered with the honest urgency of a man who had no time for comforting lies. "We're contacting him now, but right now our job is to keep you alive." They rolled him into the operating room. Cold air hit his face. Machines beeped steadily around him. Someone placed an oxygen mask over his mouth and nose. A nurse touched his arm gently. "Think of someplace peaceful, Mr. Bennett." Walter thought of Eleanor sitting on the garden bench at sunset, dirt on her gloves, smiling at him across the years. The anesthesiologist leaned over him. "You'll be asleep in just a moment." As the medication began through the IV line, Walter heard one final exchange near the doorway. "Has the son arrived yet?" "Not yet." The lights above him softened into a white haze. Walter tightened his grip on the brass key, and the last clear thought that crossed his mind before the darkness took him was simple and absolute. Daniel will be here when I wake up. The last thing Walter Bennett heard before the anesthesia pulled him under was the steady beep of a heart monitor and the faint squeak of rubber soles moving across the operating room floor. Then nothing. For a few seconds after consciousness disappeared, the world continued without him. Outside the operating room, Daniel Bennett's phone vibrated. He was standing near the vending machines at the end of the surgical corridor, staring at the closed double doors through which they had just wheeled his father. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air. Families sat scattered around the waiting room, clutching coffee cups and prayer books, their faces pale with the particular fear that only hospitals create. Daniel glanced at the screen. Mark Rutledge, Blue Ridge Capital. His stomach tightened. He almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, he answered, "Mark, I'm at the hospital." A burst of impatient static came through the speaker. "I know, but we've got a problem. The Asheville property seller is getting cold feet. If we don't close today, they're opening negotiations with the Charlotte Group." Daniel looked toward the operating room doors. "My dad just went into emergency surgery." "I'm sorry, but the investors are already wired in for this. We've got $600,000 in commitments hanging on your signature." Daniel closed his eyes. For the past 18 months, Blue Ridge Summit Development had consumed his life. Luxury mountain cabins, short-term rental projections, investor presentations filled with drone footage and promises of passive income. He had sunk nearly everything into the project: savings, lines of credit, and money borrowed against future commissions that had never materialized. This deal was supposed to save him. "What are my options?" he asked quietly. "Be here by noon with the collateral package," Mark said. "Otherwise, we're dead." The call ended. Daniel stood motionless for several seconds while the vending machine hummed beside him. Across the waiting room, Claire Bennett watched him carefully. She had been sitting with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of untouched coffee since they arrived. Her eyes were red from crying. "What did they say?" she asked. Daniel slipped the phone into his pocket. "It's the development deal." Claire stared at him in disbelief. "Daniel, your father is in surgery." "I know that." "Then why are we talking about real estate?" He ran a hand through his hair, already frustrated. "Because if this deal falls apart, we lose months of work." Claire lowered her voice. "Your father could die." The words landed hard enough that he looked away. Down the hallway, a nurse emerged from the operating suite carrying paperwork. Daniel stepped toward her immediately. "Excuse me," he said. "Walter Bennett, how long will the surgery take?" "Several hours," the nurse replied. "The surgeon will update you as soon as possible." "Is he stable?" "We're doing everything we can." It wasn't an answer. Claire touched his arm. "Stay." Daniel looked back at the waiting room. The clock on the wall read 7:18 a.m. If he left now, he could still make the closing meeting. He hated himself for calculating it. "I'm just going to step out for a little while," he said. "I can take the conference call from the parking garage and be back before they're done." Claire's expression hardened. "That's not what you're doing." "Claire, you're choosing the deal." He opened his mouth to deny it, but the denial would have sounded ridiculous even to him. A second call came in from Mark. This time Daniel answered immediately and started walking toward the elevator. Claire followed him. "Daniel, please." He stopped at the elevator doors without turning around. "You heard the nurse," he said. "The surgery will take hours. Sitting in that waiting room won't change anything." "No," Claire replied softly, "but being there would change something." The elevator arrived with a ding. Daniel stepped inside. For a brief moment, he looked genuinely torn. Fear flickered across his face. Fear for his father, fear of financial ruin, fear of watching the life he had been trying to build collapse before it ever began. Then the doors began to close. Claire stood in the hallway staring at him. "Call me the second the surgeon comes out," he said. The elevator doors sealed shut between them. At 8:46 a.m., Dr. Harris emerged from the operating room, still wearing surgical gloves and a lead apron. "Family for Walter Bennett?" he called. Claire stood up immediately. "His son stepped out," she said. The surgeon glanced around the waiting room. "I need to speak with the primary family contact." Claire checked her phone. No messages. She called Daniel. Straight to voicemail. "Daniel, it's Claire," she said after the tone. "The surgeon is out. Call me right now." Dr. Harris waited for a moment, then motioned her aside. "The aneurysm had already ruptured when he arrived," he explained. "We were able to repair it, but he lost a significant amount of blood. The next 24 hours are critical." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Is he going to make it?" "I honestly don't know yet." She looked back toward the elevator, willing it to open. It didn't. Meanwhile, 40 miles away in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the mountains, Daniel spread property surveys across a polished table while investors discussed projected rental yields. A closing attorney slid a folder toward him. "We'll need confirmation of the collateral structure before we finalize," she said. Daniel nodded automatically, though his mind kept drifting back to the hospital. His phone buzzed repeatedly. "Claire, 3 missed calls." He silenced it. "Everything okay?" Mark asked. "Yeah," Daniel said too quickly. "Family medical stuff. Let's keep moving." The attorney pointed to a highlighted section. "The Bennett hardware property strengthens the package considerably. Once your father signs the formal authorization, the lenders should release the bridge funds without issue." Daniel forced himself to focus on the documents. He told himself he would call Claire during the next break. He told himself his father was stable. He told himself this was temporary. The lies became easier each time he repeated them. Back at the hospital, the day stretched painfully. Martha Green arrived shortly after noon carrying Walter's glasses and a folded flannel shirt from his house. She found Claire alone in the waiting room. "Where's Daniel?" Martha asked. Claire hesitated too long. "He had to take care of something." Martha looked toward the ICU doors, then back at Claire's exhausted face. "Something more important than this?" Claire didn't answer. That silence told Martha everything she needed to know. By evening, Walter remained unconscious in intensive care. Machines breathed and beeped around him while nurses adjusted medications and watched for signs of internal bleeding. The visitor chair beside his bed stayed empty except for Martha, who sat there knitting with trembling hands long after visiting hours officially ended. At 9:17 p.m., the charge nurse checked the family contact information again. Primary contact, Daniel Bennett. She called the number listed on the chart. Voicemail. She left a message explaining that Walter was out of surgery and remained in critical condition. No one called back. The surgical waiting room was almost deserted now. The television mounted in the corner played a muted weather forecast. No one was watching. Cleaning staff moved quietly between the rows of empty chairs. Claire stood near the window, staring out at the hospital parking lot where rain had begun falling again in thin silver lines. Martha approached her gently. "You should go home for a few hours," she said. "I'll stay with him." Claire shook her head. "I don't understand him anymore." Martha followed her gaze toward the rain-darkened parking garage. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "people tell you who they are long before you're ready to believe them." Claire's phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Closing went through. Heading back soon. "Any update on Dad?" Claire stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Behind the ICU doors, Walter Bennett lay unconscious, fighting for his life. And somewhere on Interstate 26, driving home from a successful real estate closing, his son was already rehearsing the explanation he hoped would make leaving the hospital sound reasonable. He had no idea that before this was over, that decision would cost him far more than any failed business deal ever could. Walter Bennett surfaced from the darkness in fragments. A distant beeping, cold air against his face, voices that sounded as though they were coming from the far end of a tunnel. For a few disorienting seconds, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the pain arrived, not the tearing agony from the hardware store, but a deep, crushing soreness that seemed to wrap around his entire abdomen. He tried to move. A hand touched his shoulder immediately. "Easy, Mr. Bennett," a nurse said gently. "You're in intensive care. Surgery is over." Walter blinked against the bright overhead lights. His throat felt dry and raw. "What time is it?" he whispered. "Just after 6 in the morning." Morning. An entire day had disappeared. Memory returned in pieces. The ambulance, Ethan's worried face, the surgeon saying ruptured aneurysm, the operating room lights, and then the thought that mattered most. "Daniel?" The nurse's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Your family has been notified," she said carefully. Try not to talk too much yet. It wasn't an answer. Walter's eyes drifted toward the visitor chair beside his bed, empty. A strange unease settled over him. Daniel must have gone home to shower, or to get clean clothes, or to take care of something urgent. There were dozens of reasonable explanations. Walter clung to them because the alternative hurt too much to consider. The nurse checked his IV line and adjusted a monitor. "You had a very serious operation," she said. "The next 24 hours are important. Focus on resting." Resting was impossible. Every few minutes, he woke from shallow, medication-clouded sleep and looked toward the door, expecting to see his son appear with that apologetic half-smile he'd worn since childhood whenever he knew he'd disappointed someone. But the doorway remained stubbornly empty. Around mid-morning, another figure appeared instead. Martha Green stepped into the room carrying a small canvas tote bag and wearing the same practical rain jacket she had worn for years while delivering mail through Asheville neighborhoods. When she saw Walter's eyes open, relief flooded her face so completely that he realized she had been genuinely frightened. "Well," she said, setting the bag down carefully, "you certainly know how to scare a neighborhood." Walter managed a weak smile. "Martha, there he is." Her voice trembled despite her attempt at cheerfulness. The stubborn old mule survived. She moved closer and touched his hand lightly, as if afraid he might disappear if she held on too tightly. "What happened?" Walter asked. "Your aorta ruptured," she said softly. "Luis called 911. The doctors said you were very lucky." Lucky. The word felt absurd attached to tubes, monitors, and the burning ache that greeted every breath. Martha opened the tote bag. "I brought your glasses, your phone charger, and that terrible mystery novel you've been pretending to read for 6 months." Walter let out a faint laugh that immediately turned into a wince. "Don't make me laugh." "Good. That means you're alive enough to complain." She pulled the visitor chair closer and sat down with the ease of someone who had already spent many hours there. "How long have you been here?" Walter asked. "Since yesterday afternoon." The answer surprised him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Martha replied simply. "I did." Silence settled between them for a moment, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Walter glanced toward the door again before he could stop himself. Martha noticed. Her expression grew more complicated. "Daniel knows?" Walter asked. "He knows. When did he leave?" Martha hesitated just long enough for Walter's stomach to tighten. "He was here before surgery," she said carefully. "Claire stayed for a while too." "But he's coming back?" Martha looked down at her hands. "I'm sure he intends to," she said, and the careful wording frightened Walter more than any direct answer could have. Later that afternoon, Ethan Cole stopped by during a break between ambulance calls. He appeared in the doorway, still wearing his dark blue paramedic uniform, a cup of coffee balanced in one hand. "Well, look who's awake," he said with an easy grin. Walter recognized him immediately. "The ambulance. That was me." Ethan stepped inside. "You gave us a pretty exciting morning." "Sorry about that." "Please. It was the most interesting call I've had all week." Martha stood to give them space, but Ethan waved her back down. "How are you feeling?" he asked Walter. "Like someone replaced my insides with barbed wire." Ethan laughed softly. "That's actually a pretty accurate description of recovering from abdominal surgery." He checked the monitor almost automatically, the habits of emergency medicine impossible to turn off completely. "You scared us," he admitted. "Your blood pressure was dropping fast when we picked you up." Walter studied the young man for a moment. "You stayed after the call?" Ethan shrugged. "I asked the ICU desk how you were doing when I came back to the hospital. Occupational curiosity." Martha snorted. "That's what they call compassion now?" Ethan looked slightly embarrassed. "My grandfather died from an aneurysm," he said quietly. "He didn't get to the hospital in time, so when someone does make it, I like to know how the story ends." The words landed with unexpected warmth. Walter realized that in less than 24 hours, a neighbor and a paramedic had shown him more consistent concern than his own son. He pushed the thought away immediately. Daniel would come. He had to. As evening approached, the ICU grew quieter, lights dimmed slightly, and the hallway traffic thinned to nurses, respiratory therapists, and the occasional physician making rounds. Martha remained in the chair beside Walter's bed. "You should go home," he told her. "Get some sleep." "I can sleep tomorrow." "Martha." She fixed him with the same stern look she used to give barking dogs and overconfident teenagers when she was a postal supervisor. Walter Bennett, I spent 32 years delivering mail through Appalachian thunderstorms. Do you really think a hospital recliner is going to defeat me? Despite everything, he smiled. The smile faded quickly when he noticed the untouched second chair across the room. Martha, he said quietly, tell me the truth. She looked at him carefully. About what? Has Daniel been here at all since the surgery? The question hung in the air. Martha could have lied. She could have protected him for one more night, one more fragile stretch of recovery. Instead, she chose kindness over comfort. No, she said softly, not since before they took you into the operating room. Walter stared at the ceiling. For several seconds, he said nothing. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep, 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 beep. He called? Walter asked finally. Claire called the hospital a few times yesterday. Daniel sent messages asking for updates. Messages, not visits. Not sitting through the long hours of uncertainty while surgeons fought to keep him alive. Just messages. Walter closed his eyes. A memory surfaced uninvited. Daniel, at 8 years old, terrified after falling from his bicycle. Walter had spent the entire night sitting beside his bed, holding an ice pack against a swollen knee, while Daniel slept with one hand wrapped around his father's wrist. Back then, Walter would have walked through fire for that boy. When had things changed? Had they changed suddenly, or had he simply failed to notice? Martha reached over and squeezed his hand. You don't have to figure everything out tonight, she said. But Walter wasn't trying to figure everything out. He was trying to understand why the chair beside his hospital bed was occupied by a retired postal worker instead of his own son. Outside the ICU windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, Martha settled deeper into the visitor chair, pulled a small knitting project from her tote bag, and began working quietly under the dim hospital light. She stayed through the evening medication rounds. She stayed through the shift change. She stayed until the nurses stopped treating her like a visitor and started treating her like part of Walter's support system. And sometime after midnight, as Walter drifted in and out of exhausted sleep, he woke briefly to see Martha still sitting there, glasses low on her nose, knitting needles moving steadily in the half-light. The sight filled him with gratitude so sharp it almost hurt. Because in the longest night of his life, when fear and pain had stripped away every illusion of independence, the person who remained beside him was not bound by blood, obligation, or inheritance. She stayed because she cared. And somewhere beyond the rain-darkened hospital walls, Daniel Bennett was sleeping in his own bed, unaware that with every passing hour, the empty chair beside his father was becoming evidence of something far more serious than absence. At 7:14 the next morning, Daniel Bennett stood on the balcony of a luxury condominium overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. The view was spectacular. Morning sunlight spilled across rolling ridgelines. A thin layer of mist floated through the valleys below. Real estate brochures loved views like this. Investors loved views like this. Daniel stared at it without seeing any of it. His phone buzzed. Martha Green calling. He let it ring. A few seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared. He didn't listen to that either. Instead, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked inside. The condominium belonged to one of the investors involved in Blue Ridge Summit development. They had gathered for breakfast before another day of meetings, projections, financing discussions, and negotiations. The room smelled of coffee and fresh pastries. Mark Rutledge was already seated at the dining table reviewing documents. There he is, Mark said, our future mountain king. A few people laughed. Daniel forced a smile. Normally, he enjoyed that kind of praise. Today, it landed differently. One investor slid a report across the table. The lenders are asking for additional reassurance about collateral. Daniel nodded. We can provide that. The words came automatically. For months, he had repeated variations of the same promise. Everything was under control, everything would work out, everything was just one deal away from success. But underneath that confidence lived a truth he rarely admitted, even to himself. Blue Ridge Summit wasn't thriving. It was surviving. Barely. The development had consumed far more money than expected. Construction estimates had increased, permits had taken longer, investors had become impatient. Several private loans were approaching repayment deadlines. Daniel needed this project to succeed, not because he wanted more wealth, because failure would expose how fragile everything already was. Mark leaned forward. The Bennett property remains the strongest asset in the package. Daniel felt tension tighten across his shoulders. The Bennett property, not the hardware store, not his father's life's work, not the place where generations of local families bought lumber and paint. To investors, it was simply collateral, an asset, a line item, a safety net. The language made everything sound cleaner than it really was. Once the authorization is finalized, Mark continued, the lenders should release the next phase of funding. Daniel nodded again. A familiar knot formed in his stomach. The authorization. Technically, nothing was final. Technically, his father still needed to approve key portions of the arrangement. Technically, Daniel had been planning to explain everything eventually. Those technicalities had become increasingly inconvenient. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Claire. He stared at her name for several seconds before answering. "Hey, where are you?" Claire asked. The disappointment in her voice arrived before the words themselves. "In a meeting. Your father is awake." Daniel closed his eyes. For a brief moment, relief flooded through him. Awake. Alive. Thank God. "How is he?" "He asked for you." The sentence struck harder than he expected. Daniel turned away from the table and stepped toward the balcony doors. "What did the doctors say?" "He's stable for now." For now. The same phrase everyone seemed to be using. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "I'll come by later." A long silence followed. Then Claire asked the question he had been avoiding. "When?" He didn't answer immediately, because he didn't know. Not really. The meeting would continue through lunch. Then there were lender calls, then additional paperwork, then investor reviews. Always one more thing, always something that couldn't wait. Finally, he said, "This afternoon." Claire exhaled slowly. "You said that yesterday." Before he could respond, she ended the call. Daniel stared at the dark screen. For the first time, he felt something dangerous creeping beneath his confidence. Not guilt. Not yet. Something closer to discomfort. The uncomfortable realization that every excuse sounded reasonable individually. But together, they were beginning to form a pattern. Across town, Walter sat upright for the first time since surgery. The effort exhausted him. His abdomen felt as though someone had replaced every muscle with broken glass. But he was determined. A physical therapist had helped him walk 12 feet that morning. 12 feet. The accomplishment would have sounded ridiculous a week earlier. Now it felt like climbing a mountain. Martha sat nearby with a newspaper folded in her lap. "You're frowning again," she observed. "I'm thinking. Dangerous hobby." Walter almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he looked toward the door. Still no Daniel. The disappointment had started changing shape. At first, it had felt like worry, then confusion. Now something colder was taking its place. Questions. Questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The room's television quietly displayed financial news. A scrolling headline caught his attention. A story about commercial real estate loans, property-backed financing, development risks. Ordinarily, he would have ignored it. Today, it reminded him of Daniel. The thought lingered longer than it should have. "How's the business?" Walter asked suddenly. Martha shrugged. "Luis says everything's running fine." "Any unusual visitors?" She looked surprised. "Not that I've heard." Walter nodded slowly. Something about the question felt important, though he couldn't yet explain why. That evening, Ethan Cole returned. He wasn't working. He carried a paper bag from a local diner. "You brought contraband food into a hospital?" Martha asked. "I brought pie." "That's worse." Walter laughed despite himself. Ethan handed him a small container. "Doctors approved soft foods." Walter lifted the lid. "Apple pie, Eleanor's favorite." For a moment, he couldn't speak. Ethan immediately looked concerned. "Too soon?" Walter shook his head. "No, just unexpected." The young paramedic sat down. Figured hospital food wasn't exactly helping recovery. For several minutes, they talked about ordinary things. Weather, baseball, road construction, anything except surgery and disappointment. The conversation felt surprisingly comforting, and then Ethan asked an innocent question. "So your son coming by tonight?" The room fell silent. Martha lowered her eyes. Walter stared at the pie container. Ethan immediately realized he'd stepped onto painful ground. "I'm sorry," he said. Walter waved him off. "It's all right." But it wasn't. Not really. because the question revealed something he had been trying not to acknowledge. Everyone expected family to show up. Everyone. The nurses expected it. The doctors expected it. Martha expected it. Even Ethan, who had known him for less than 48 hours, expected it. Only Daniel seemed unaware of the obligation. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, another meeting was ending. Investors gathered their papers. Handshakes were exchanged. Numbers were discussed. Future profits were imagined. Daniel should have felt victorious. The project had survived another day. The lenders remained interested. No one had pulled out. Everything he had worked toward was still alive. So why did the success feel strangely hollow? As he packed his briefcase, Mark approached. "Hospital tomorrow?" Daniel nodded. "Definitely." Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Family first." The irony nearly made Daniel laugh. Instead, he simply said, "Yeah, family first." The words followed him all the way to the parking garage, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, he found himself wondering whether some opportunities became expensive long before anyone received the bill. As he drove into the gathering darkness, he still believed he had time to fix everything. He had no idea that events already unfolding behind the scenes would soon make that impossible. Walter Bennett woke fully at 3:17 a.m. on Friday morning. This time, the darkness did not pull him back under immediately. The room was dim except for the soft green glow of monitors and the faint blue light from the nurse's station outside the glass doors. Rain still tapped against the hospital windows, though more gently now, like the storm had exhausted itself. For a moment, he simply listened. Beep, beep, beep. His heart, still beating. He turned his head slowly. The movement sent a dull ache through his abdomen, but it was manageable now, less like a knife and more like a heavy weight pressing against his core. The visitor chair beside the bed was empty. Again. Walter stared at it for a long time. The emptiness looked different in the middle of the night. During the day, an empty chair could mean someone had stepped out for coffee, for a phone call, for a quick trip home. At 3 in the morning, it meant something else. It meant no one had stayed. A nurse noticed his eyes open and entered quietly. "Mr. Bennett," she said with a warm smile, "you're awake. Can I have some water?" She helped him sip from a cup through a straw. The coolness eased the rawness in his throat. "What day is it?" he asked. "Friday." Tuesday morning to Friday morning. 3 days gone. The realization settled heavily over him. He had nearly died, undergone emergency surgery, spent days unconscious in intensive care, and somehow the world had continued moving without him. The nurse checked his blood pressure and adjusted the blanket. "Your recovery is looking encouraging," she said. "The surgeon will be pleased." Walter hesitated. Then he asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since he first opened his eyes. "Has my son been here tonight?" The nurse's hands paused for the briefest moment. Professional training quickly smoothed the expression from her face, but Walter saw enough. "No visitors tonight," she answered gently. The words were not cruel. That made them worse. Walter looked away toward the dark window. Outside, the hospital parking lot reflected scattered pools of yellow light. Cars came and went. Somewhere below, an ambulance siren rose faintly and then faded into the distance. He tried to picture Daniel walking through the ICU doors. The image came easily. Daniel carrying coffee, Daniel apologizing for being delayed, Daniel sitting in the chair beside the bed and saying, "I'm here now, Dad." The problem was that the picture existed only in Walter's imagination. Reality remained stubbornly empty. At 6:40 a.m., Martha arrived carrying a thermos and a small paper bag from the bakery near the hardware store. "You're awake," she said with visible relief. "Apparently I'm difficult to get rid of. That's one of your better qualities." She poured coffee for herself and settled into the chair as if continuing a conversation they had merely paused rather than ending one overnight. Walter studied her for a moment. Her gray hair was slightly damp from the morning drizzle. She looked tired, but she was here. That simple fact had begun to matter more than he knew how to express. "Martha," he said quietly, "how long was I unconscious?" "Most of Wednesday and part of Thursday." "And Daniel?" She sighed softly. "He called yesterday afternoon." Walter waited. "He asked if the doctors thought you were out of danger. Did he ask to speak with me?" "No." The answer landed with surprising physical force. Walter had spent years making excuses for Daniel's increasing distance. "He's busy. The real estate market is demanding. Young couples have their own lives. He'll come around eventually. Those explanations had always seemed reasonable from the comfort of his own kitchen. They sounded much thinner in an ICU bed. Martha reached into her bag and handed him a folded napkin. Inside was a cinnamon roll. The nurses said you can have a few bites if you behave yourself. Walter stared at it. Eleanor used to bring him cinnamon rolls from that same bakery every Friday morning before opening the store. The memory hit so suddenly that his eyes burned. Martha pretended not to notice. Later that morning, Dr. Harris came by with a resident trailing behind him. "Well, Mr. Bennett," the surgeon said, reviewing the chart, "you're making better progress than I expected." "High praise from a man who cut me open," Dr. Harris chuckled. "We repaired a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. Most patients who arrive in your condition don't get to complain about hospital food afterward." The resident smiled politely. Walter gathered his courage. "How close was it?" Dr. Harris became more serious. "Very close," he said honestly. "Another 30 minutes before surgery, and I don't think we'd be having this conversation." Walter absorbed that quietly. 30 minutes. Such a small amount of time to separate life from death. The surgeon continued discussing medications, physical therapy, and recovery restrictions, but Walter's mind lingered on that number. 30 minutes. And during those same hours, Daniel had been in a conference room discussing property collateral. The comparison arrived uninvited. Walter wished it hadn't. That afternoon, Ethan stopped by again, this time in plain clothes. "No uniform today," Walter observed. "Day off," Ethan replied. "Thought I'd check whether you were still terrorizing the nursing staff." Martha snorted. "He's working on it." Ethan pulled up a chair. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." "That's progress." For a while, they talked about ordinary things, the upcoming tourist season, road construction downtown, whether Asheville would ever solve its parking problems. The normal conversation felt strangely healing. Eventually, Ethan glanced around the room. "You've got a good support team," he said. Walter followed his gaze to Martha. "Yes," he replied after a pause. "I do." The truth of the statement surprised him, because the support team he had imagined all his life looked very different from the one sitting in front of him now. Near evening, Claire finally appeared. She looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she carried the tense, brittle energy of someone who had spent days arguing with herself. "Hi, Walter," she said softly. "Hi, Claire." Martha stood. "I'm going to give you two a few minutes." After she left, silence settled heavily over the room. Claire sat down and twisted her wedding ring nervously. "I'm sorry I haven't been here more," she said. "Things have been complicated." Walter studied her face carefully. "Where's Daniel?" The question clearly hurt her. "He's dealing with some business issues." Walter almost laughed at the absurdity of the phrase. Business issues, as if his emergency surgery were a scheduling conflict rather than a near-fatal catastrophe. Claire looked down at her hands. "He keeps saying he's coming tomorrow," she admitted. Tomorrow. Walter closed his eyes briefly. There was always another tomorrow. Another meeting, another call, another urgent problem that somehow mattered more than the present moment. "Claire," he said quietly, "tell me something honestly." She looked up. "If the situation were reversed, if Daniel were lying in this bed, would I have left the hospital to handle paperwork?" Tears immediately filled her eyes. "No," she whispered. The answer hurt because it was true. Walter looked toward the window, where evening light was fading behind the mountains. For the first time since waking up, he allowed himself to consider a possibility he had been resisting, with all the stubbornness that had built Bennett Hardware over 4 decades. Maybe Daniel's absence was not an accident. Maybe it was not temporary. Maybe it was a choice. Claire wiped at her eyes. "He loves you," she said quickly, almost desperately. "He's just under a lot of pressure right now." Walter nodded slowly. He wanted to believe her. God help him. He still wanted to believe her. But as he looked at the empty visitor chair beside his bed, one thought kept returning with relentless clarity. Pressure reveals character. And in the moment when Walter Bennett had needed his son most, the person who had remained beside him was not bound by blood, inheritance, or obligation. It was the widow next door who brought cinnamon rolls and stayed through the night. Outside the ICU window, the rain finally stopped. Inside, Walter watched the last light fade from the sky and realized that surviving surgery might not be the hardest part of what lay ahead. Saturday morning brought sunlight for the first time since Walter's surgery. Golden light spilled across the ICU room, turning the pale hospital walls almost warm. The storm had moved east overnight, leaving the Blue Ridge Mountains sharp and blue against a cloudless sky. Nurse Kelly was helping Walter sit in a chair by the window when his phone vibrated on the tray table. Daniel, calling, Walter stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Morning, Dad." Daniel sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. "Morning. How are you feeling today?" "Better." "That's great news. I've been worried sick." The phrase landed awkwardly after 4 days of absence. Walter kept his voice neutral. "Have you?" A small pause. "Of course I have." Walter looked out the window at the mountains while Daniel continued talking about traffic, meetings, and how hard it had been to coordinate everything since the emergency. The explanations came smoothly, almost rehearsed. "I should have been there more," Daniel admitted. "Things have just been insane this week." Walter waited for the real apology. It never came. "When can I see you?" he asked instead. "Tomorrow for sure," Daniel replied quickly. "I've got one last investor meeting this afternoon, but after that I'm completely free." "Tomorrow." Again. Walter's grip tightened slightly on the phone. "I nearly died on Tuesday, Daniel." Silence filled the line. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was softer. "I know, Dad. I'm sorry. I really am." For a brief moment, Walter heard genuine emotion there, and it stirred the part of him that still wanted desperately to believe his son was simply overwhelmed rather than indifferent. "We'll talk tomorrow," Walter said. "Absolutely. Love you, Dad." "Love you too." The words came automatically, shaped by 39 years of fatherhood. After the call ended, Walter continued staring at the dark screen. Something bothered him. Not what Daniel had said, what he hadn't said. No questions about the surgery, no questions about the doctors, no questions about whether Walter needed anything, just assurances that he would come tomorrow, as if his father's near-fatal emergency were an inconvenience to be rescheduled. Later that morning, Martha arrived carrying fresh clothes from Walter's house. "I brought your blue sweater," she announced. "The nurses said they're trying to get you out of the ICU tomorrow." Walter managed a smile. Escaping intensive care. Big milestone. She began folding the clothes into the cabinet while Walter absently unlocked his phone. A red notification badge caught his attention. Bennett Hardware and Supply, business banking alert. He frowned and opened the app. A pending authorization request appeared on the screen. Blue Ridge Summit Development LLC, transfer authorization, pending approval amount, $850,000. Walter stared at the number. His pulse quickened. He had not authorized any transfer. In fact, he had not logged into the business banking system in over a week. "Martha," he said slowly, "has anyone been in my office at the store?" She turned around. "Not that I know of. Why?" Walter handed her the phone. Her eyes widened as she read the notification. "What is that?" "I don't know." But even as he said the words, a cold suspicion began forming. Blue Ridge Summit Development. Daniel's company. Walter opened the details. The request had been submitted Tuesday at 11:42 a.m. He looked at the timestamp twice. Tuesday, 11:42 a.m. He tried to remember where he had been at that exact moment. The operating room, under anesthesia, fighting for his life. The room suddenly felt colder. "Martha," he said carefully, "what time did my surgery start?" "Early Tuesday morning. Around 7, I think." "And I didn't wake up until Friday." "That's right." Walter looked back at the screen. The authorization request required dual approval for any transfer over $100,000. One approval had already been entered under his administrator profile. His administrator profile. A dull throb started behind his eyes. Someone had accessed the business banking system while he was unconscious. Someone with credentials connected to Bennett Hardware. Martha sat down slowly. Could it be a mistake? Walter wanted to say yes. He wanted to laugh and explain that the bank had made an error, that the system had generated a duplicate request, that there was some perfectly innocent explanation. Instead, he heard himself ask, "Do you remember Daniel mentioning a development company called Blue Ridge Summit?" Martha nodded reluctantly. "A few times. He seemed very excited about it." Walter's stomach tightened. He opened the account activity log. The pending transfer was not the only unusual item. Over the past 3 weeks, there had been multiple inquiries into the business reserve account, several document downloads, and a request for property valuation records tied to the hardware store building. Each action had been performed using credentials associated with the owner's administrative account, his account. A nurse entered to check his vitals and immediately noticed the tension in the room. Everything all right? Walter locked the phone screen. Just business paperwork. The nurse smiled sympathetically. That store must be important to you. It's my life, Walter replied quietly. After she left, Martha spoke in a low voice. What are you thinking? Walter took a long breath. I'm thinking my son may have been handling business matters while I was unconscious. Martha's expression darkened. Without telling you? I don't know yet. But the unease had already become something more solid than uncertainty. That afternoon, Ethan stopped by again, carrying a small notebook. Physical therapy homework, he explained. My sister's a rehab nurse. She says patients who track their walking goals recover faster. Walter accepted the notebook with a faint smile. Your family seems determined to keep me alive. Ethan grinned. Occupational hazard. As they talked, Walter found himself studying the young paramedic's easy sincerity. Ethan had no financial stake in his recovery, no inheritance, no business interest. Yet he kept showing up. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. When Ethan stepped out to get coffee, Walter reopened the banking app. This time he looked more closely at the authorization details. A scanned signature file had been attached to the transfer request. Walter zoomed in. At first glance, it looked like his signature, but something was wrong. Subtle, almost invisible. Walter Bennett had signed documents the same way for 45 years, Walter J. Bennett. The scanned authorization read Walter Bennett, no middle initial. Eleanor had teased him for decades about always including the J. Your father gave you that initial, she used to say. You treat it like a sacred family heirloom. He had never signed major business documents without it. Never. A chill moved through him that had nothing to do with the hospital air conditioning. Someone had copied his signature. Poorly. Martha returned just as Walter lowered the phone. What is it? He looked at her for a long moment before answering. I think, he said slowly, someone tried to move $850,000 out of Bennett Hardware while I was unconscious. Martha went completely still. Walter? He stared at the empty visitor chair beside his bed. For the first time since the surgery, a terrible new possibility entered his mind. What if Daniel's absence from the hospital was not merely neglect? What if he had been busy doing something that required his father not to be awake? The thought was so painful that Walter almost rejected it immediately. Almost. But as the afternoon sun faded across the mountains and the pending transfer notification remained glowing on his phone, one fact stood stubbornly in front of him. The authorization had been submitted at 11:42 a.m. Tuesday. And at 11:42 a.m. Tuesday, Walter Bennett had been unconscious on an operating table with his chest open to death. Someone had known he could not say no. The missing signature. Walter did not sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. Blue Ridge Summit Development LLC, $850,000 authorization, submitted Tuesday 11:42 a.m. The numbers glowed behind his eyelids like a warning light that refused to turn off. At 5:11 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep and sat upright in bed, the movement still painfully slow. The ICU was quiet except for the soft hum of ventilators from neighboring rooms and the distant squeak of a medication cart rolling down the hallway. He picked up his phone again. The pending transfer request was still there. Unapproved. Waiting. Walter zoomed in on the attached signature until the pixels began to blur. Walter Bennett. Not Walter J. Bennett. Such a tiny omission. One letter. But Eleanor had been right about many things, including his stubbornness about signatures. He had signed contracts, tax returns, payroll checks, and property deeds the same way since he was 23 years old. The missing middle initial was not just a discrepancy. It was a fingerprint left by someone who knew his signature well enough to imitate it, but not well enough to reproduce it perfectly. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Ethan stepped into the room carrying 2 coffees. Thought you might be awake, he said. ICU patients either sleep like rocks or stare at the ceiling planning world domination. Walter managed a tired smile. What if I'm doing both? Then I definitely brought the right amount of caffeine. Ethan handed a cup to Martha, who had arrived moments earlier and was settling into her now customary chair beside the bed. Walter hesitated. Then he made a decision. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I need your opinion on something." He handed over the phone. Ethan read the banking notification, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to focused attention. "That's a lot of money," he said carefully. "Look at the timestamp." Ethan did. His eyes lifted immediately. "That was while you were in surgery." Walter nodded. Ethan zoomed in on the attached signature. "Is this yours?" "Close," Walter said, "but not quite." Ethan studied it for another moment. "My dad's a contractor," he said slowly. "I've watched him sign invoices for 30 years. People develop habits, little patterns." "What do you see?" "The pressure's wrong," Ethan replied, "and the signature looks copied from a scanned document, not written naturally." Walter felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. Martha looked between them. "You're saying someone forged it?" "I'm saying," Ethan answered carefully, "if this were part of an ambulance report investigation, I'd want a handwriting expert to look at it." The room fell silent. Walter stared out the window toward the mountains, now hidden behind a layer of morning fog. A week ago, his biggest concern had been whether the store's winter inventory would arrive before the first snowstorm. Now he was sitting in intensive care, discussing the possibility that someone had attempted to forge his authorization for an $850,000 transfer, someone who had access to his business accounts. Someone who knew he was unconscious, someone who knew exactly when he could not object. Later that morning, a physical therapist helped Walter walk a slow circuit around the ICU ward. 12 steps. Pause. 8 more. Pause again. The effort left sweat beading on his forehead, but the movement cleared his head enough for the pieces to begin fitting together. Blue Ridge Summit development, Daniel's urgent investor meetings, the collateral discussions, the unanswered hospital calls, the forged authorization requests submitted while Walter was under anesthesia. Individually, each fact could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. When Walter returned to his room, Martha handed him a folder. "Luis dropped this off," she said. "Said it was on your desk at the store." Inside were copies of recent business correspondence. Most of it was routine: supplier invoices, payroll summaries, insurance renewals. Then Walter found a property valuation request dated 3 weeks earlier, requested by Daniel Bennett. Purpose: commercial financing review. Attached was an appraisal of the hardware store building, the adjacent warehouse, and the apartment above the store where Walter had lived since Eleanor's death. The total appraised value was highlighted in yellow, $3,240. Walter's pulse quickened. He flipped to the next page. A preliminary financing worksheet listed the property as potential collateral asset. Potential collateral asset: his home, his business, his father's legacy. Reduced to a financing category on a spreadsheet. Martha watched his face carefully. "What is it?" Walter handed her the appraisal. Her eyes widened as she read. "He had the store appraised?" "Apparently." "Did you authorize this?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. Yeah, Walter remembered Daniel asking casual questions over the past few months. "What do you think the building's worth now? Have you ever considered refinancing? Commercial property values downtown have gone crazy." At the time, the questions had seemed harmless. Now they looked very different. That afternoon, Daniel finally arrived. Walter heard his voice in the hallway before he saw him. "Dad, they moved you out of the critical section?" Daniel stepped into the room carrying flowers from the hospital gift shop and wearing an expensive charcoal jacket that looked far more appropriate for a business presentation than a hospital visit. He smiled broadly when he saw Walter sitting upright. "Wow," he said. "You look so much better." Walter studied him carefully. Daniel looked rested, well-fed, not like someone who had spent the last 4 days keeping vigil beside a dying parent. "Thanks for coming," Walter said evenly. Daniel set the flowers down and pulled up the visitor chair. "Traffic was terrible getting up here," he said, "and the investor meetings have been absolutely insane." There it was again. Investors, meetings, business before the conversation had even begun. Daniel reached for Walter's hand. "I'm really sorry I couldn't be here more, Dad." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked quietly, "Where were you Tuesday at 11:42 in the morning?" The question hit Daniel like a slap. His expression froze for a fraction of a second before recovering. Tuesday? I was dealing with the development financing. Why? Walter picked up his phone and turned the screen toward him. Daniel's face lost color as he read the notification. For the first time since entering the room, he looked genuinely alarmed. What is this? He asked too quickly. That's what I was hoping you could tell me. Daniel stared at the screen, then forced a short laugh. Oh, this. It's just a preliminary financing request. Nothing actually happened. You used my administrator credentials. I have access to some of the business systems, Dad. You gave me access years ago. For bookkeeping, Walter replied softly, not for authorizing $850,000 transfers. Daniel shifted in the chair. It wasn't a real transfer. The bank requires a draft authorization before lenders can review the package. Walter held up another document, the property appraisal. And this? Daniel's jaw tightened. I was exploring refinancing options. I was going to talk to you about it. When? Silence. Walter watched his son carefully. The confident real estate investor from the hallway was gone now. In his place sat a man calculating answers, searching for the least damaging explanation. I've been under a lot of pressure, Daniel said finally. Pressure, the same word Claire had used. The same word everyone seemed to use when trying to explain behavior that should not need explaining. Walter leaned back slowly, feeling the ache in his abdomen sharpen with the movement. Daniel, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. His son looked up. I was unconscious when that authorization was submitted. Another silence. Longer this time. Outside the window, a helicopter passed over the hospital, its distant thumping echoing through the mountains. Inside the room, father and son looked at each other across a widening space that had nothing to do with the hospital bed between them. Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak. Before he could, Walter asked the question that had been growing inside him since dawn. Did you think I might not wake up? The question hung in the room like smoke. Did you think I might not wake his father? And for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he had no immediate answer. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Dad, no, he said finally. Of course not. Walter held his gaze. You submitted an $850,000 authorization while I was unconscious. It was a draft request. You had the store appraised without telling me. I was planning to discuss refinancing. You left the hospital before my surgery was finished. Daniel's shoulders tightened. I made a mistake, he said. I should have stayed. The admission sounded genuine, but it also sounded incomplete. Walter had spent 40 years negotiating with suppliers, contractors, and bank officers. He knew the difference between someone telling the truth and someone telling part of the truth. Before he could press further, a nurse entered with medications. Mr. Bennett, I need to check your incision and give you your antibiotics. Daniel stood awkwardly. I'll let them work, he said. Can we talk later? Walter nodded once. Daniel hesitated as if he wanted to say something else, then picked up his jacket and left the room. The door closed softly behind him. Martha returned a few minutes later carrying fresh coffee. Well, she asked carefully. Walter looked exhausted. He admitted leaving the hospital was a mistake. That's not the same thing as admitting what he was doing. No, Walter agreed quietly. It isn't. He stared at the folder of documents on the tray table. The appraisal, the financing worksheet, the forged authorization request, pieces of a puzzle that still lacked its center. That evening, after the nurses dimmed the lights and the hallway grew quieter, Martha pulled a small cardboard box from beneath her chair. I almost forgot, she said. I stopped by your house this afternoon to water the tomatoes. Walter smiled faintly. The tomatoes are probably healthier than I am. Probably. But that's not why I'm showing you this. She set the box on the bed. It was one of Eleanor's old stationery boxes, covered in faded blue fabric with tiny gold flowers along the edges. Walter's chest tightened immediately. He had not seen it since shortly after Eleanor's funeral. I found it in the bottom drawer of the secretary desk, Martha said. There was an envelope sitting on top with your name on it. Walter lifted the envelope carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Robert, if you ever have doubts about Daniel, read this. For a long moment, he simply held it. Eleanor's handwriting had always been elegant and deliberate, each letter formed with the patience of someone who believed words mattered. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter written on Eleanor's cream-colored stationery. My dearest Robert, if you are reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either I worried unnecessarily, or something has finally forced you to see what I have been afraid to say out loud. Walter swallowed hard. Martha quietly looked away, giving him privacy even while remaining in the room. He continued reading. I know you believe Daniel is simply ambitious. I know you think grief has made him restless, and perhaps some of that is true. But over the last year, I have watched something change in him. He asks about account balances more than family stories. He talks about the value of the building more than the history inside it. When I was sick, he spent more time discussing future expansion plans than asking whether I was frightened. Walter's vision blurred slightly. Memories surfaced uninvited. Daniel standing in Eleanor's hospice room talking about downtown property values. Daniel asking whether the warehouse could be converted into mixed-use commercial space. At the time, Walter had interpreted those conversations as optimism, a son trying to think about the future because the present was too painful. Eleanor had seen something else. He kept reading. Please understand, I am not writing this because I do not love our son. I love him fiercely. That is precisely why I am frightened. Ambition is not a sin, but ambition without loyalty becomes hunger, and hunger has a way of consuming everything around it. A tear slipped down Walter's cheek. Martha silently handed him a tissue. The final paragraphs were written more shakily, the handwriting less steady. If there ever comes a day when Daniel must choose between protecting you and protecting his financial future, pay very close attention to the choice he makes. Do not excuse it. Do not soften it. Do not tell yourself he meant well if his actions say otherwise. You have spent your entire life taking care of other people. Promise me that if the time comes, you will finally take care of yourself. Forever yours, Eleanor Walter lowered the letter slowly. The room was silent except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Beep, beep. He pressed the paper against his chest and closed his eyes. For several minutes, neither he nor Martha spoke. When he finally opened his eyes again, they were filled not only with grief, but with something deeper. Recognition. She knew, he whispered. Martha nodded gently. I think she saw things you didn't want to see. Walter let out a shaky breath. She was dying, and she was still trying to protect me. He looked back at the letter. One sentence seemed to burn brighter than all the others. If there ever comes a day when Daniel must choose between protecting you and protecting his financial future, pay very close attention to the choice he makes. Tuesday morning, emergency surgery. Daniel leaving the hospital for a real estate closing. The choice had already been made. Walter realized with a painful clarity that Eleanor had not written a prediction. She had written a warning, and he had opened it 4 days after surviving the very test she feared might one day come. Martha touched his arm lightly. What are you going to do? Walter folded the letter carefully along its original creases. Then he noticed something else inside the envelope. A second sheet of paper had been tucked behind the letter. It was not handwritten. It was a business card. Rebecca Lawson Estate Planning and Trusts. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, were 6 words. Ask her about the amended trust. Walter stared at the card. The hospital room suddenly felt smaller. There had been more. Eleanor had not only worried, she had acted. She had acted. Walter looked from the business card to the empty visitor chair beside his bed, then back to his wife's letter. Outside the window, the last light of evening faded behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. Inside, a widower sat in a hospital bed holding evidence that the woman who knew him best had anticipated this moment long before he ever imagined it could happen. And somewhere beyond, on those darkening mountains, his son still believed the most dangerous thing waiting for him was a difficult conversation with his recovering father. He had no idea that Eleanor Bennett's final act of love was about to change everything. Rebecca Lawson arrived at the hospital the next morning at 9:12 sharp. Walter noticed the precision immediately. She was in her mid-60s, silver-haired, wearing a navy suit that looked expensive without trying to look expensive. The kind of woman who had spent decades handling other people's secrets and had learned that calm authority was more powerful than dramatic confidence. She carried a leather portfolio and a thermos of tea. Mr. Bennett, she said warmly, extending her hand. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. Eleanor trusted you. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. She did. Very much. Martha stood to leave, but Walter shook his head. Stay, he said. If Eleanor wanted me to read that letter, I think she'd want witnesses. Rebecca sat down and opened her portfolio. I received your message this morning, she said, and after reading the note Eleanor left, I suspected why you contacted me. Walter handed her the letter and the business card. Rebecca read the note silently, then closed her eyes for a brief moment. She really did leave this, she murmured. I wondered whether you'd ever need it. The words sent a chill through Walter. You knew? I knew Eleanor was worried, Rebecca replied carefully. She asked me to prepare certain documents in case her concerns proved justified. Walter leaned back against the pillows, feeling suddenly older than his 68 years. What kind of documents? Rebecca opened the portfolio and removed a thick folder labeled Bennett Family Trust, Amendment File. Walter stared at it. I thought our estate plan was straightforward, he said. Everything to the surviving spouse, then to Daniel. That was the original plan, Rebecca confirmed. Eleanor changed it 6 months before she died. The room fell silent. Martha's knitting needles stopped moving. Walter felt his heartbeat quicken despite the monitors and medications. What did she change? Rebecca hesitated, choosing her words with obvious care. Before I answer that, I need to ask you a few questions. Did Daniel provide any care during your hospitalization? Walter almost laughed at the understatement. He came by once yesterday for about 20 minutes. And before that? He was here before surgery. Then he left. Rebecca made a note. Did he return during the first 72 hours after your operation? No. Martha spoke quietly. I was here most of that time. He never came back. Rebecca nodded again, her expression growing more serious. Then she opened the folder. Inside were notarized documents bearing both Walter's and Eleanor's original trust signatures, along with a later amendment executed solely by Eleanor under provisions allowed by their estate structure. She turned to a section marked Article 7, Conditional Succession Provisions. Eleanor requested this amendment after several conversations about Daniel's financial behavior, Rebecca explained. At the time, I advised her that it was unusual but legally permissible. Walter took the document with trembling hands. The legal language was dense, but one paragraph had been highlighted in yellow. In the event that the surviving spouse, Walter James Bennett, experiences a life-threatening medical emergency requiring hospitalization or incapacitation, any inheritance designated for Daniel Robert Bennett shall remain conditional upon the beneficiary demonstrating reasonable care, presence, and support during said emergency, as determined by the trustee and documented through medical and witness records. Walter read the paragraph twice, then a third time. She built a test, he whispered. Rebecca nodded slowly. She hoped it would never matter. Martha looked stunned. My God. Walter continued reading. The amendment defined reasonable care and presence as physical presence within 48 hours of notification whenever reasonably possible. Meaningful participation in medical decisions and support, demonstrated concern for Walter Bennett's welfare beyond financial or administrative interests. Failure to meet those conditions would trigger a review allowing the inheritance to be reduced, redirected, or revoked at the trustee's discretion. Walter lowered the document. She really believed he might choose money over me. Rebecca folded her hands carefully. Eleanor never said it that bluntly, but she was deeply troubled by several things she observed during her illness. Memories surfaced painfully. Daniel asking whether the store's warehouse could be redeveloped while Eleanor was undergoing chemotherapy. Daniel discussing investment opportunities during hospice visits. Eleanor watching those conversations with quiet, unreadable eyes. Walter had interpreted her silence as exhaustion. Now he wondered if it had been heartbreak. Rebecca continued gently. She told me, if Daniel proves me wrong, I'll be the happiest fool in North Carolina. The sentence hit Walter harder than any legal clause because it revealed what Eleanor had truly wanted, not punishment, proof that her fears were unfounded. Walter looked at the empty visitor chair beside his bed. 4 days, one brief visit, investor meetings, collateral discussions, forged authorizations. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. Rebecca removed another document from the folder. There's more. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Of course there is. This concerns the business. She slid a property protection notice across the tray table. Eleanor had established a mechanism allowing the hardware store property to be transferred into a protected trust structure if Rebecca determined that Walter was vulnerable to financial exploitation during a medical crisis. Walter stared at her. Financial exploitation. Rebecca met his gaze directly. Walter, I've spent 35 years in estate law. When a family member attempts to leverage a critically ill person's assets while that person is incapacitated, I take it very seriously. Walter handed her the bank notification screenshots and the property appraisal Daniel had ordered. Rebecca's expression darkened as she reviewed them. He submitted this authorization while you were under anesthesia? Yes. And he had the property appraised without your knowledge? Yes. Rebecca was silent for a long moment. Then she closed the folder decisively. I think we need to obtain the full transaction logs from the bank immediately. Martha leaned forward. You think Daniel actually tried to move the money? I think someone using credentials connected to Bennett Hardware initiated an unauthorized financing process during Walter's incapacitation, Rebecca replied with lawyerly precision. Whether that constitutes fraud depends on the underlying documentation and intent. Intent. That word hung heavily in the room. Walter thought about Daniel's face when confronted with the authorization request. Surprise. Fear. And something else he could not quite identify. Not innocence. More like panic that he had been discovered too soon. Rebecca pulled out her phone. I'm going to request emergency access to the account audit trail, she said. As co-trustee under the amended provisions, I have authority to investigate potential financial abuse. She paused before dialing. Walter, once I start this process, there may be consequences that cannot be undone. I need to know whether you want me to proceed. The question forced everything into focus. This was no longer just a painful family disagreement. It was a choice between protecting his son from scrutiny and protecting the business that had supported their family for 40 years. Walter looked at Eleanor's letter resting beside him on the bed. Do not excuse it. Do not soften it. Slowly he nodded. Proceed. Rebecca made the call. As she spoke quietly with the bank's fraud department, Walter turned toward the window. Sunlight had broken through the clouds again, illuminating the distant mountains with impossible clarity. For the first time since waking up in intensive care, he felt something unexpected beneath the grief and confusion. Not anger. Not yet. Something steadier. Resolve. Because the question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was how much was wrong. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, Daniel Bennett was still operating under the dangerous assumption that his father remained too weak, too grateful to be alive, and too blinded by parental love to follow the money. He was about to discover that surviving death had changed Walter Bennett in ways neither of them yet understood. Rebecca Lawson returned Monday afternoon carrying a thicker folder than before. Walter knew immediately that she had found something. The expression on her face was not shock. Rebecca was too experienced for that. It was worse. It was the calm, professional look of someone who had confirmed exactly what she feared. Martha was sitting by the window reading when Rebecca entered. She closed the book without a word. Tell me, Walter said. Rebecca set the folder on the tray table and removed several documents. I spoke with the bank's fraud investigator this morning, she began. I also obtained public filings for Blue Ridge Summit Development, LLC. She slid the first document toward him. State of North Carolina, Business Entity Report. Walter skimmed the page. Managing Member, Daniel Robert Bennett. Additional investors, Blue Ridge Capital Partners, outstanding commercial loan applications, $4.2 million. His stomach tightened. That's much larger than he ever told me. Rebecca nodded. The development is not a small side project. It's a highly leveraged commercial venture. She opened another section of the folder. These are the lender correspondence records. Highlighted passages jumped off the page. Collateral package remains incomplete pending confirmation of Bennett Hardware property interest. Borrower represented that family commercial property would be available as secondary security. Walter looked up slowly. He promised them the hardware store. Not formally, Rebecca replied, but he represented that the property could be pledged as collateral once authorization was completed. Martha let out a low breath. My God. Walter kept reading. The projected loan structure used the hardware store building, the warehouse, and the apartment above the store to secure a $1.8 million bridge loan. If the development failed, the lenders could move against the collateral, against Bennett Hardware, against his home, against the business his father had built from nothing. For a moment, Walter could not speak. The room seemed to tilt slightly despite the steady hospital bed beneath him. All this time, he said quietly, he wasn't trying to expand the business. Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. He was trying to use the business to save the development. Walter closed the folder and stared at the ceiling. A memory surfaced with painful clarity. 3 months earlier, Daniel had stood in the warehouse looking unusually enthusiastic. "Dad, this property is sitting on a gold mine. Downtown Asheville commercial values are exploding." Walter had laughed and told him he sounded like a real estate commercial. Daniel had laughed too. Now the memory felt entirely different. Not excitement. "Assessment," Rebecca continued. "There's another issue." Walter looked back at her. The fraud investigator traced the Tuesday authorization request. It originated from an IP address associated with Daniel's condominium. The words landed like a hammer. Martha went completely still. Walter felt the air leave his lungs. "You're certain?" "As certain as the bank can be at this stage. The request was submitted from a device connected to his residential network at 11:42 a.m. Tuesday. The exact hour Walter had been in surgery. The exact hour Daniel had claimed to be handling urgent financing matters. Any remaining space for innocent coincidence began to disappear. Walter pressed a hand against his abdomen, feeling the dull ache beneath the bandages. Not from surgery, from betrayal. Rebecca slid another document forward. This is the most troubling part. It was a draft term sheet from Asheville Commercial Lending Group. Under the section labeled Borrower Contributions, a handwritten note appeared in blue ink. "Father currently hospitalized. Signature expected upon recovery. If complications occur, succession structure may simplify authorization." Walter read the sentence twice, then a third time. His vision narrowed. "Complications," he whispered. Martha's face had gone pale. Rebecca spoke carefully. "I cannot prove who wrote that note, but it appears on Daniel's financing packet." Walter looked at the paper for a long moment. If complications occur, not if he recovers, not after we discuss this with him. Complications. The cold, clinical language of someone discussing a business obstacle rather than a human life. For the first time since the surgery, anger began to push through the grief. Not explosive anger. Something quieter and more dangerous. The anger of a man who realizes he has been treated as an asset instead of a father. A knock interrupted the silence. Luis Herrera stepped into the room carrying a small notebook from the store. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, then noticed the tension immediately. "Bad time?" Walter shook his head. Luis approached the bed. "I brought the weekly inventory reports. Thought you might want to see that the place is still standing." Walter smiled faintly. "Thanks, Luis." As Luis set the notebook down, he noticed the appraisal documents spread across the tray table. "That's the downtown property valuation," he said automatically. "Daniel asked me to pull maintenance records for that appraisal last month." Walter looked up sharply. "He asked you?" "Yeah, said you were considering refinancing to free up capital for some expansion opportunity." The last piece clicked into place. Daniel had not merely explored possibilities. He had already been gathering supporting documentation from the store staff while presenting the process as something Walter had approved. Luis frowned as he realized what he had just revealed. "Walter, you did approve it, right?" The silence answered for him. Luis's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Oh no." Walter looked away. He could not bear the pity in another person's eyes. After Luis left, Rebecca closed the folder decisively. "Walter, I need to be very direct now." He nodded. If the lenders had received a fully executed authorization package, Blue Ridge Summit could have obtained financing secured in part by Bennett Hardware. Given the project's debt structure, a default would have placed the business and your residents at significant risk. "How significant?" Rebecca met his eyes. "You could have lost everything." The words settled over the room with crushing weight. 40 years of work, Eleanor's security, his father's legacy, all of it exposed to a speculative mountain resort project that Daniel had never fully disclosed. Walter turned toward the window. Outside, late afternoon sunlight painted the Blue Ridge Mountains gold and copper. He thought about the thousands of customers who had walked through Bennett Hardware's doors over 4 decades, contractors rebuilding after storms, young couples buying paint for their first homes, retired neighbors who came in as much for conversation as for supplies. The store was not just property, it was a piece of the community's memory, and his son had been willing to gamble it. Rebecca spoke softly. The protective property notice is ready to file. Once it's recorded, the hardware store cannot be pledged as collateral without your direct notarized approval and trustee confirmation. Walter did not answer immediately. He thought about Daniel as a little boy sweeping sawdust from the floor with a broom too large for his hands. He thought about teaching him how to make change at the register. He thought about the pride he had felt when he first gave Daniel a key to the store. Then he looked down at the financing packet with the handwritten note. If complications occur, something inside him changed. Not his love for his son. That stubbornly remained. But the belief that love required him to ignore the truth finally began to die. Walter picked up Eleanor's letter from the bedside table. Do not excuse it. He looked at Rebecca. File the notice, he said quietly. Rebecca nodded once and reached for her phone. As she began the process of protecting Bennett Hardware from the very man who expected to inherit it, Walter stared out at the mountains and realized that surviving the aneurysm had saved more than his life. It had saved him just in time to discover what his son was really building with the family legacy. And somewhere across town, Daniel Bennett was preparing for another investor meeting, still believing that the collateral package was only one signature away from completion. He had no idea that, at that very moment, the door to the hardware store was beginning to close to him forever. Claire arrived just after 7:30 Tuesday evening, long after visiting hours technically ended. The nurses recognized her by now and let her through with only a sympathetic nod. Walter was sitting in the chair by the window, a blanket draped over his legs, watching the last traces of sunset fade behind the mountains. He looked stronger than he had the day before, but there was a new hardness around his eyes that Claire had never seen before. Martha stood when she entered. I'll give you some privacy, she said quietly. Claire waited until the door closed behind her before speaking. You're looking better. That's what everyone keeps telling me. She sat down slowly, twisting her wedding ring the way she always did when she was anxious. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Walter broke the silence first. Daniel said he'd come yesterday. Claire looked down at her hands. I know. He didn't. Another silence. Walter studied her carefully. She looked exhausted, not from lack of sleep alone, but from carrying something heavy for too long. Claire, he said gently, what's really going on? Her eyes filled immediately. I don't know where to start. Start with the truth. The words seemed to undo something inside her. She took a shaky breath. Daniel's been in trouble for months. Walter felt his stomach tighten. What kind of trouble? Financial trouble. She looked toward the window as if the mountains might somehow make the confession easier. The development project has been bleeding money. Investors keep demanding progress, contractors want deposits, and Daniel keeps borrowing against future funding that never quite arrives. Walter listened without interrupting. He told me it was temporary, Claire continued. He said once the first phase sold, everything would stabilize. But it didn't. She shook her head. No, it got worse. Walter thought about the loan documents, the collateral package, the forged authorization request. Did he tell you he was using Bennett Hardware as collateral? Claire hesitated. Not at first. The answer was enough. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I found this 3 weeks ago. Walter unfolded it carefully. It was a lender checklist from Asheville Commercial Lending Group. Several items were highlighted. Property appraisal completed. Owner financial statements pending. Authorization signature required. Bennett Hardware commercial asset documentation attached. At the bottom, in Daniel's handwriting, was a note. Need Dad to sign before October 15. Walter stared at the words for a long moment. You knew about this? Tears spilled down Claire's cheeks. I confronted him the night I found it. He said it was just a backup financing option that you'd understand once he explained the growth strategy. Did he ever intend to explain it? Claire didn't answer. That silence hurt almost as much as the documents themselves. I begged him not to involve the store, she whispered. I told him it was your retirement, your home, everything you and Eleanor built. What did he say? Claire closed her eyes briefly. He said, Dad has more equity sitting in that building than he'll ever use. This is how wealthier families build generational wealth. Generational wealth. Walter almost laughed at the bitter irony. He had spent 40 years building something stable, reliable, and debt-free. Daniel had turned it into leverage for a speculative resort development. Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The morning of your surgery, he got a call from one of the investors while we were sitting in the waiting room. Walter remembered the empty chair. What did he say? He stepped into the hallway, but I heard enough. The seller was threatening to walk away from the mountain property if the financing package wasn't finalized that day. Walter felt a dull ache spread through his chest, and he chose the deal. Claire nodded miserably. I told him he was making a terrible mistake. I told him if something happened to you, he'd never forgive himself. Walter looked at her carefully. Did he seem worried about me? The question broke her. Claire covered her mouth for a moment before answering. Yes, she said honestly. He was worried, but he was also terrified that losing the deal would destroy everything he'd worked for. That distinction mattered. Daniel had not stopped caring entirely. He had simply cared about two things at once and chosen the wrong one when forced to decide. Sometimes that was an even more painful truth. Claire took another deep breath. There's something else. She reached deeper into her purse and removed a small black USB flash drive. Walter frowned. What's that? Copies of files from Daniel's home office computer. Walter looked at her sharply. Claire? I know it's wrong, she interrupted quickly. But after your surgery, after he kept avoiding the hospital, I got scared. She placed the drive on the tray table between them. I copied the files 2 nights ago while he was asleep. Walter picked up the drive slowly. It felt impossibly small for something that might contain answers capable of destroying a family. What's on it? Loan applications, investor emails, property valuations. I didn't read everything, but I saw enough to know the situation is much worse than he's admitting. She hesitated, then added in a whisper, There's a folder labeled Bennett Asset Strategy. The name sent a chill through Walter. Not family plan. Not retirement discussion. Asset strategy. The language of finance, not love. Claire leaned forward desperately. I'm not giving this to you because I want to hurt Daniel. I'm giving it to you because I think he's drowning, and drowning people sometimes pull everyone else under with them. Walter looked at the flash drive, then at his daughter-in-law. For years he had thought of Claire as the quiet one, the peacekeeper who avoided conflict whenever possible. Tonight, she looked like someone who had finally reached the point where silence felt more dangerous than truth. Does Daniel know you copied these files? No. Would he be angry if he found out? Her laugh was short and humorless. He'd probably say I betrayed him. Walter turned the flash drive over in his fingers. The irony was almost unbearable. The person bringing him evidence was not his son. It was the woman married to his son. Outside the window, darkness settled fully over Asheville. The lights of downtown flickered on below the hospital, small and steady against the mountains. Walter thought about Eleanor's letter. Pay very close attention to the choice he makes. Daniel had made his choice in the surgical waiting room. Now Claire was making hers. She stood slowly, shoulders sagging with exhaustion. I don't know what happens next, she said. Walter looked up at her. Neither do I. She moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, she said softly, I don't think Daniel started out trying to hurt you. Walter believed that, and somehow that made everything even sadder. After she left, he sat alone in the quiet hospital room holding the flash drive. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. On the tray table beside him lay 3 things. Eleanor's warning letter, the amended trust documents, a flash drive containing the hidden financial life of his only child. Walter stared at them for a long time. Then he reached for his phone and typed a message to Rebecca Lawson. We need to meet tomorrow. Claire brought evidence. I think it's time to see how deep this really goes. He hit send. Across town, Daniel Bennett was sitting in his condominium reviewing investor projections, unaware that the person who had shared his bed for 12 years had just handed his father the key to everything he had been trying to hide. And for the first time since the aneurysm ruptured, Walter began to understand that this was no longer just a family crisis. It was an investigation. Rebecca Lawson arrived Wednesday morning carrying a laptop, a portable scanner, and an expression that told Walter she had spent most of the night working. Martha was already there, knitting abandoned in her lap. "You look like a woman bringing either very good news or very bad news," Walter said as Rebecca entered. Rebecca set the equipment down carefully. "That depends on how you define good news." Walter held up the black flash drive Claire had given him. "I think this belongs to the bad news category." Rebecca took the drive and connected it to her laptop. The folder structure appeared on the screen almost immediately. Investor updates, lender correspondence, Blue Ridge financials, personal, Bennett asset strategy. The last folder drew all three of their eyes. Rebecca opened it. Inside were spreadsheets, scanned property records, copies of Bennett hardware insurance policies, and a document titled Collateral Transition Plan. Walter felt his mouth go dry. Rebecca opened the document. The first page outlined a proposed financing structure using Bennett hardware as secondary security for Blue Ridge Summit's bridge loan. The second page contained a timeline. October 10 to 15, obtain Walter Bennett authorization. October 16 to 20, record collateral agreement. Contingency. If Walter remains medically incapacitated, pursue temporary financial management authority through family emergency provisions. Walter stared at the screen. Temporary Financial Management Authority, he repeated. Rebecca's voice was very quiet. That appears to refer to seeking control over certain business operations if you were unable to manage them yourself. Martha looked horrified. He was planning for you not to recover. Walter kept reading. A handwritten note appeared in the margin beside the contingency section. Discuss with attorney whether medical incapacity allows expedited access to business accounts. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the steady beep of Walter's heart monitor. Not because he wanted his father dead. Walter could see that now with painful clarity. Daniel had convinced himself he was preparing for every possible outcome, but somewhere along the way, preparing for the possibility of his father's death had become more important than sitting beside him while he fought to stay alive. Rebecca closed the document slowly. "I think we need to discuss the trust now." Walter nodded. She opened a separate file from her portfolio, the complete amendment Eleanor had executed before her death. "This is the section I showed you yesterday," she said, pointing to the conditional inheritance clause. "But there's an attached memorandum explaining Eleanor's intent." She handed Walter the additional pages. Eleanor's handwriting filled the first page. "Rebecca, if this clause is ever activated, I want Robert to understand that this is not about punishing Daniel for being imperfect. It is about determining whether he still understands that family is a responsibility, not an investment." Walter swallowed hard. Rebecca continued explaining. "The trust establishes a review process triggered by a life-threatening medical emergency. I've already obtained the hospital records." She laid out a timeline. Tuesday, 6:12 a.m., emergency admission. Tuesday, 7:03 a.m., surgery begins. Tuesday, 8:46 a.m., surgeon requests family contact. Tuesday, 9 p.m., critical condition update left for Daniel. Wednesday, no visit. Thursday, no visit. Friday, 4:22 p.m., first documented visit after surgery. Rebecca looked up. Under the trust definition, Daniel did not provide reasonable care and presence during the critical period. Martha spoke softly. He left before the surgery was even finished. Walter closed his eyes briefly. The facts looked even harsher written in chronological order. Not because they were exaggerated, because they were precise. Rebecca slid another document across the tray table. "This is the formal trustee review notice. If you sign it, the conditional inheritance process is officially activated." Walter read the heading, Notice of Review, Conditional Succession Provisions. Beneath it, a single paragraph summarized the issue. Preliminary evidence indicates that beneficiary Daniel Robert Bennett may have failed to satisfy the care and presence requirements established under Article 7 of the Bennett Family Trust during the hospitalization of Walter James Bennett beginning October 10th. At the bottom waited a signature line. Walter set the paper down without signing it. "I need to ask something," he said quietly. Rebecca nodded. "If I do this, Does Daniel automatically lose everything? No, Rebecca replied. The trust gives the trustee discretion. The inheritance can be reduced, suspended, redirected, or revoked depending on the circumstances. So this is still my decision. Yes. Walter looked toward the window. Morning sunlight illuminated the distant mountains, but he barely saw them. He saw a little boy sitting on the floor of the hardware store counting washers into coffee cans. He saw a teenager learning to drive the delivery truck. He saw a young man standing beside Eleanor at her funeral, tears running down his face. That boy had existed. Walter was certain of it. The question was whether the man sitting in investor meetings while his father lay unconscious had become someone else entirely. Martha touched his arm gently. You don't have to decide this minute. But Walter knew the truth. The decision had begun the moment Daniel walked out of the surgical waiting room. Everything since then had simply been evidence. He picked up Eleanor's letter again and reread the final lines. You have spent your entire life taking care of other people. Promise me that if the time comes, you will finally take care of yourself. A tear slipped down his cheek. Not because of the money. The money had never been the real loss. The real loss was realizing that Eleanor had been carrying this fear while she was dying, and he had loved her too blindly to see it. Rebecca waited patiently. Finally, Walter picked up the pen. His hand shook slightly as he signed. Walter James Bennett. This time, with the middle initial exactly where it belonged. Rebecca took the signed notice and placed it carefully back into the folder. It's done, she said softly. Martha let out a slow breath she seemed to have been holding for days. Walter leaned back against the pillows, suddenly exhausted. What happens now? Rebecca's expression was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Now we protect what Eleanor spent her last months trying to protect. Outside the hospital window, a hawk circled above the Blue Ridge Mountains, riding a current of cold autumn air. Inside, Walter Bennett looked at the signed trustee notice and realized that something irreversible had just happened. For 40 years, he had believed his greatest responsibility was providing for his son. For the first time in his life, he had chosen a different responsibility, protecting the truth, even from the person he loved most. By Thursday morning, Walter had been moved from intensive care to a private recovery room overlooking the eastern side of Asheville. The room was larger, quieter, and somehow more dangerous. In the ICU, survival had been the only priority. Here, with the immediate threat of death receding, there was space for decisions. And decisions, Walter was discovering, this could hurt far more than surgery. A thin layer of autumn fog drifted between the Blue Ridge ridgelines as Rebecca Lawson spread documents across the small table near the window. Martha sat nearby with a cup of tea, watching Walter carefully. You should know, Rebecca said, adjusting her glasses, once we file these documents, we're not simply reacting to Daniel's behavior anymore. We're creating a new future for Bennett Hardware. Walter looked at the papers. Trust agreements, property transfer drafts, employee benefit schedules, 40 years of work reduced to legal language and signature lines. What are my options, he asked. Rebecca folded her hands. There are 3 realistic paths. She held up one finger. First, you could leave everything as it is and hope Daniel eventually stabilizes his finances. Walter almost smiled at the absurdity of that hope. A second finger. Second, you could disinherit him entirely and transfer the business to another beneficiary. Martha shifted uncomfortably. And the third? Rebecca slid a new document toward him. The Eleanor Bennett Community Trust. Walter frowned. What is that? A structure I drafted years ago for another family-owned business, Rebecca explained. After reading Eleanor's memorandum, I adapted it for Bennett Hardware. He scanned the first page. The proposal would place the hardware store, warehouse, and associated real estate into an employee-owned community trust. Longtime employees would receive profit-sharing rights, operational control would remain local, and the business could not be sold without approval from a governing board. Walter looked up slowly. You're suggesting the store belong to the people who helped build it. I'm suggesting, Rebecca replied gently, that legacy and bloodline are not always the same thing. The words settled heavily in the room. For years, Walter had assumed the store would pass naturally to Daniel, not because Daniel had earned it, because he was his son. That assumption suddenly felt less like tradition and more like inertia. Rebecca continued. The trust could also provide for specific individuals without giving them ownership control. She pointed to several highlighted provisions: lifetime housing rights for Martha Green in the adjacent apartment if she ever needed them, educational scholarships for local trade school students in Eleanor Bennett's name, retirement security protections for employees with more than 15 years of service. Walter stared at the scholarship provision. Eleanor had always worried that young people were being pushed toward expensive college degrees while skilled trades were being treated as second-class work. She would have liked that, he murmured. Rebecca smiled softly. I thought so too. Later that afternoon, Luis Herrera arrived with fresh inventory reports and a bag of sandwiches from the deli down the street. He looked nervous when he saw the stack of legal documents. Everything okay? He asked carefully. Walter motioned him inside. Sit down for a minute, Luis. Luis obeyed, though his expression suggested he suspected this was not an ordinary business conversation. Walter studied the man who had worked beside him for 23 years. Luis had started as a part-time stock clerk at 19. Walter had watched him marry, raise children, buy his first home, and become the steady backbone of the store's daily operations. How long have you been opening the store when I'm out sick? Walter asked. Luis blinked. Probably 15 years. And how many times have you missed payroll? None. Walter nodded slowly. Do you know why Bennett Hardware survived when so many family businesses didn't? Luis shrugged. Good customers? Good people, Walter corrected. Customers came because good people were standing behind the counter. Luis glanced uneasily at Rebecca. Walter, if this is about Daniel, I don't want to get involved in family. It's not about taking sides, Walter interrupted gently. It's about understanding what actually keeps a business alive. He handed Luis the summary page of the proposed trust. Luis read it silently. His eyes widened. You can't be serious. Why not? Because this place is your family's business. Walter looked around the hospital room, then back at the man who had spent nearly a quarter-century helping him carry lumber, calm angry customers, unload delivery trucks, and keep the doors open through recessions and floods. Maybe my definition of family has been too narrow, he said quietly. Luis looked genuinely shaken. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything yet. But the conversation planted something important. For the first time since the aneurysm ruptured, Walter felt a flicker of possibility that was not connected to Daniel's approval or disappointment, a future that protected the store instead of gambling it. That evening, after everyone else had left, Walter sat alone by the window with Eleanor's letter in his lap. The city lights of Asheville twinkled below the hospital like scattered embers. He thought about the first day he and Eleanor had opened the expanded hardware store in 1986. They had celebrated with cheap champagne in paper cups because they couldn't afford real glasses after paying the contractors. Eleanor had stood in the empty showroom and said, Promise me something, Robert. If we're lucky enough to build something worthwhile, never let it become more important than the people who help us build it. At the time, he had assumed she meant employees and customers. Now he wondered if she had also meant himself. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Martha stepped back into the room carrying a small container. I brought soup, she announced. Hospital food is officially a human rights violation. Walter smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in days. As she fussed with the container and complained about institutional cooking, he watched her move around the room with comfortable familiarity. She had watered his tomatoes, brought his clothes, stayed through the nights, argued with nurses when they tried to send her home. Not once had she asked about money, property, or inheritance. The contrast with Daniel was becoming impossible to ignore without feeling cruel. Martha, he said suddenly. She looked up. If something happened to me, why did you stay? The question seemed to surprise her. She set the soup down and thought for a moment before answering. Because Eleanor would have, she said simply, and because you've spent 40 years taking care of half this neighborhood, it would have been a disgrace to let you go through this alone. Walter felt his throat tighten. Such a simple answer. No spreadsheets, no collateral packages, no contingency plans, just loyalty. He looked back at the trust documents spread across the table. For the first time, the decision no longer felt like punishment. It felt like alignment. aligning the future of Bennett Hardware with the values that had created it in the first place. The next morning, Rebecca returned with the final draft. Walter read every page carefully. Then he picked up the pen. His signature moved slowly but steadily across the documents. Walter James Bennett. When he finished, Rebecca gathered the papers and placed them into her portfolio. "It's done," she said quietly. "Bennett Hardware is now protected from any collateral claims related to Blue Ridge Summit development." Walter leaned back, exhausted but strangely lighter. Outside the window, the fog had lifted completely. Sunlight flooded the mountains. For the first time since waking up in intensive care, Walter realized he was no longer merely surviving what his son had done. He was building something new from the wreckage of what he had believed about family. And somewhere across town, Daniel Bennett was still preparing investor projections, unaware that the business he had been counting on as collateral had just been placed permanently beyond his reach. Friday morning began with the sound of church bells drifting faintly across downtown Asheville. Walter was standing beside the hospital bed, gripping a walker with both hands while a physical therapist counted his steps. 10 more, she encouraged. "You said that 5 steps ago." "That's because you keep surviving them." Walter managed a tired smile and took another careful step. The movement still pulled painfully at the long incision beneath his sweater, but each day the pain felt slightly less like a wound and slightly more like a reminder that he was still alive. When the therapist finally left, he lowered himself into the chair by the window and reached instinctively for the brass key resting on the bedside table. He had asked Martha to bring it from the store. The metal was worn smooth from decades of use. His father's hand had polished it first, then his own. Walter turned it slowly between his fingers, thinking about all the mornings it had opened Bennett Hardware before sunrise. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Rebecca entered carrying a slim folder and, for the first time in days, a faint expression of satisfaction. "You look pleased," Walter observed. "I filed the protective notices at the county recorder's office an hour ago." Walter straightened slightly. "That fast? I didn't think we should give anyone additional time to move paperwork around." She handed him a stamped copy. Protective Property Restriction. Eleanor Bennett Community Trust. Recorded 8:14 a.m. Walter read the document carefully. Effective immediately. Bennett Hardware, the warehouse, and the adjoining residential property could not be pledged, refinanced, transferred, or encumbered without Walter's direct notarized approval, trustee certification, and board authorization from the newly established community trust. Blue Ridge Summit development was specifically excluded from any existing or future collateral claims. Walter let out a slow breath. "So it's protected?" "Yes," Rebecca said. "Legally speaking, the store is now behind several locked doors." For the first time since discovering the financing scheme, Walter felt a measure of relief that reached deeper than the medications or the reassurances from doctors. The business was safe. Eleanor's legacy was safe. His home was safe. Martha arrived a few minutes later carrying fresh coffee and blueberry muffins. "Why does everyone look less miserable today?" she asked. Rebecca held up the stamped filing. Martha read the heading and broke into a grin. "Well," she said, "that deserves real coffee instead of this hospital mud." They shared a quiet moment that felt almost normal. Almost. Then Walter's phone rang. Daniel calling. The three of them looked at the screen. Walter answered. "Morning, Dad." Daniel sounded unusually upbeat. "I've got some good news. The investors are finally moving forward. We're close to locking in the next phase of financing." Walter said nothing. Daniel continued talking, energized in a way Walter had not heard since before Eleanor became ill. "If everything goes through, this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. I know things have been rough, but I think we're finally turning the corner." Walter looked at Rebecca. She remained perfectly still, but her eyes told him she understood the irony. Daniel was celebrating financing that depended on collateral he no longer had access to. "That's interesting," Walter said carefully. "You sound tired. How's the recovery?" "Getting stronger every day." "That's great. Listen, I may need to stop by the store this weekend to pull a few additional property documents for the lenders. Nothing major." Rebecca's eyebrows lifted slightly. Walter felt a cold clarity settle over him. Even now, Daniel was still operating as if the hardware store remained available to support the development. Daniel, Walter said quietly, don't pull any more property documents. A pause. What do you mean? I mean, don't pull any more property documents. The cheerfulness faded from Daniel's voice. Did something happen? Walter chose his words carefully. I've made some changes to the business structure while I've been recovering. Another silence. What kind of changes? We'll discuss it in person. Dad, if this is about the financing package, I really need to know what's going on. The lenders are expecting updated collateral verification. Walter looked out the window at the mountains glowing in the morning sun. For a moment, he imagined telling Daniel everything right then: the trust, the protective filings, Eleanor's amendment, the community ownership structure. But this conversation deserved to happen face to face. We'll talk soon, he said. Dad, Walter ended the call. The room was quiet for several seconds. Martha spoke first. He still thinks the store is part of his financing plan. Walter nodded slowly. Rebecca closed her folder. It won't be for much longer. That afternoon, Luis visited again with payroll reports and a small envelope. What's this? Walter asked. Customer messages, Luis said. People heard you were in the hospital. Inside were handwritten notes from contractors, retirees, church members, and families who had shopped at Bennett Hardware for years. Take your time getting well. The store can wait. Thank you for helping us rebuild after the flood. Asheville needs you back. Walter read them one by one, his eyes growing damp. So many lives, so many small acts of kindness he had forgotten almost as soon as he'd done them. Luis watched him quietly. You know, he said, most businesses don't get letters like that. Walter folded the notes carefully. Maybe the business did more than sell hardware. As Luis prepared to leave, he hesitated. Daniel came by the store yesterday. Walter looked up sharply. What did he want? He asked whether we had copies of the property survey and the warehouse maintenance records. I told him I'd need your approval before releasing anything else. Pride flickered through Walter, despite everything. Thank you, Luis shrugged. Something about the whole situation didn't feel right. After he left, Walter sat quietly for a long time. Daniel was still trying to gather documents, still trying to keep the financing alive, still unaware that the foundation beneath the deal had already been removed. Late that evening, Rebecca returned with one final item. A courtesy notice went out to Asheville Commercial Lending Group this afternoon, she said. Walter looked up. What kind of notice? Notification that Bennett Hardware and Supply is no longer available as collateral for any pending Blue Ridge Summit financing application. Walter absorbed that slowly. Which means, Rebecca said calmly, the next time Daniel speaks with his lenders, he's going to discover that the asset he's been counting on has legally disappeared from the transaction. Outside the window, the lights of Asheville shimmered against the dark mountains. Walter tightened his grip on the brass key. For days, he had felt like a man reacting to betrayal. Tonight, for the first time, he felt like a man who had finally locked the door before everything inside could be taken away. And somewhere across town, Daniel Bennett was probably reviewing investor projections, still believing that one more meeting, one more document, one more signature would save Blue Ridge Summit. He had no idea that, at 8:14 that morning, his mother's final act of protection had quietly closed the hardware store to him forever. Walter was discharged from the hospital on Monday afternoon, 11 days after the aneurysm ruptured. The October air felt shockingly fresh after so many days surrounded by disinfectant, fluorescent lights, and the constant electronic heartbeat of hospital machines. Ethan wheeled him to the entrance despite Walter's protests. I can walk, Walter grumbled. And I can ignore stubborn patients professionally, Ethan replied. Martha followed behind, carrying a small mountain of discharge papers, medications, and the blue sweater Walter had worn home. When the automatic doors opened, cool mountain air rushed across Walter's face. He stopped for a moment. The sky above Asheville was a deep autumn blue, and somewhere nearby someone was burning leaves. The faint, smoky scent hit him with unexpected force. Home. Not the hospital. Not the ICU. Home. Ethan squeezed his shoulder lightly. Good to see you on this side of the ambulance ride. Walter looked at the young paramedic and felt a surge of gratitude that was difficult to put into words. You've done more for me than some relatives, he said quietly. Ethan smiled awkwardly. Just doing my job. No, Martha corrected gently. You did more than that. The drive through downtown Asheville felt surreal. Familiar streets passed by the car window, the diner where Walter and Eleanor used to eat breakfast on Saturdays, the church where they had been married, the bookstore Eleanor loved even though she always claimed she was only browsing. When they turned onto his street, Walter's chest tightened. The little white house looked exactly the same. That was the strange thing about crises. The world rarely changed its appearance to match your pain. Martha helped him up the front steps slowly. Inside, the house smelled faintly of furniture polish, tomato plants from the back porch, and Eleanor's lavender sachets that still hung in the bedroom closet. Walter stood in the living room for a long moment, overwhelmed by the silence. Not the lonely silence he had known since Eleanor's death. A different silence. The silence of a man returning from the edge of death and realizing that nothing in his home knew how close he had come to disappearing from it. Martha set the medication bag on the kitchen counter. "I stocked the refrigerator yesterday," she announced briskly, clearly sensing his emotions and choosing practicality over sentiment. "Soup, eggs, fruit, and absolutely nothing that qualifies as bachelor food." Walter managed a weak laugh. "You've become very bossy." Near-death experiences give neighbors special authority. As she moved around the kitchen, Walter noticed something that made him stop. On the small table by the window sat Eleanor's garden gloves. Martha followed his gaze. "I found them on the back porch," she said softly. "I didn't know whether to put them away." Walter picked them up carefully. Dirt still clung to the fingertips from the tomatoes Eleanor had planted during her final summer. For a moment, he could almost see her standing at the sink, complaining that he watered everything too much. The ache that followed was familiar now, but gentler than it had been in the hospital. Grief had stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a permanent room inside him. That evening, after Martha left with strict instructions about medications and walking exercises, Walter made his way slowly to the secretary desk in the living room. The drawer where Martha had found Eleanor's letter was still slightly open. Inside were old utility bills, birthday cards, warranty papers, and a lifetime of ordinary domestic history. Walter sat carefully in Eleanor's chair and looked around the room. Family photographs covered the mantel. Daniel at age 6 holding a fish almost as big as he was. Daniel graduating high school. Daniel and Claire on their wedding day. Eleanor crying openly beside them. So much love documented in smiling snapshots. How had they arrived here? Walter opened Rebecca's folder again. The protective filings were complete. The community trust was active. The inheritance review process had been triggered. Legally, the future of Bennett Hardware had already changed. Emotionally, the hardest part still lay ahead. His phone buzzed. Daniel calling. Walter answered. "Hey, Dad. Claire told me you got home today. That's fantastic. Feels good to be out of the hospital. How are you holding up?" "Still walking slower than I'd like." Daniel laughed lightly. "Well, don't start lifting lumber tomorrow." For a brief moment, the conversation sounded almost normal. Then Daniel's tone shifted. "I talked to one of the lenders this afternoon, and they said there was some kind of notice filed regarding the Bennett property." Walter closed his eyes briefly. Here it was. "Yes," he said calmly. "I made some changes while I was recovering." "What kind of changes?" "Changes that protect the store." A pause. "Protected from what?" Walter looked at Eleanor's letter lying open on the desk. "From being used in ways I never approved." The silence on the line grew heavier. "Dad, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Is there?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "Can we talk about this in person?" "That's exactly what I was going to suggest." Walter looked at the calendar hanging beside the desk. Sunday evening, Eleanor's old family dinner night. "Come for dinner Sunday," he said. "You and Claire, 6 o'clock. Another pause, shorter this time. "Okay," Daniel agreed. "We'll be there." After the call ended, Walter remained sitting at the desk for a long time. Sunday dinner. How many hundreds of Sunday dinners had Eleanor hosted in this house? Pot roast in winter, corn on the cob in summer, Daniel doing homework at the kitchen table while she cooked. The thought of confronting his son across that same table made his chest ache more than the surgical incision. The next few days passed slowly. Walter followed the walking schedule, sorted through business papers, and spent long stretches sitting on the back porch watching autumn leaves drift across the yard. Martha came by every morning. Luis visited twice with store updates. Ethan stopped in once carrying a bag of apples from a roadside orchard. Piece by piece, ordinary life began stitching itself back together. But beneath the routine, Sunday waited. On Saturday evening, Walter made a decision. He pulled a manila folder from Rebecca's briefcase and placed inside it the unauthorized bank authorization request, the property appraisal, the lender term sheet, the timeline of his hospitalization, a copy of Eleanor's amended trust clause. Then he added one final item, Eleanor's handwritten letter. He carried the folder to the dining room and set it at the head of the table where he normally sat. The sight of it there made the coming confrontation suddenly feel real. Not a possibility, a certainty. Sunday arrived cold and clear. By late afternoon, the house smelled of Eleanor's beef stew recipe, which Martha had insisted on helping him prepare. She'd haunt both of us if we served takeout for a family meeting this important, Martha declared. As dusk settled over Asheville, Walter set the table for three. 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 cloth napkins Eleanor had embroidered years ago. Finally, he placed the sealed manila folder beside his own plate. The brass key rested in his pocket, heavy against his leg. At 5:58 p.m., headlights swept across the front window. Walter's heart began to pound hard enough that he could feel it against the healing incision. Martha appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You don't have to do this tonight if you're not ready." Walter looked toward the dining room, where Eleanor's photograph watched over the table from the mantel. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." The doorbell rang. Walter slipped Eleanor's letter back into the folder, touched the brass key in his pocket, and whispered words he had not spoken aloud since the hospital. "Ellie, I hope I'm finally seeing things clearly." Then he walked slowly toward the front door, unaware that the next 2 hours would permanently change the Bennett family forever. At exactly 6:03 p.m., the doorbell rang again. Walter had only just reached the foyer. The short walk from the dining room left him slightly breathless, and he paused with one hand resting against the wall until the tightness in his abdomen eased. Outside the frosted glass panels, he could see 2 familiar silhouettes. Daniel stood tall and relaxed, one hand in the pocket of his charcoal overcoat. Claire stood beside him holding a covered dish, her posture noticeably stiffer. Walter opened the door. For a brief moment, everything looked almost painfully normal. "Dad!" Daniel stepped forward immediately and wrapped his arms around him in a careful hug. "It's so good to see you home." Walter returned the embrace, though more gently than Daniel probably noticed. "Come in." Claire kissed his cheek softly. "You look much better." "I'm getting there." The warmth of the house met them as they entered. The smell of beef stew filled the hallway, mingling with the scent of fresh bread Martha had baked that afternoon. Daniel looked around with a smile that carried genuine nostalgia. "I haven't smelled Mom's stew in years." The comment caught Walter off guard. For a second, he saw not the ambitious developer buried in loan documents, but the boy who used to come running into this kitchen after Little League practice, asking whether dinner was ready. Martha appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Well," she said, "look who finally remembered where this house is." Daniel gave an awkward laugh. "Fair enough. I deserve that." If the remark stung him, he hid it well. That was the first thing Walter noticed as they moved into the dining room. Daniel looked comfortable. Not like a man walking into a confrontation. Not like someone expecting his entire financial future to be questioned. He looked like a son arriving late to a difficult family gathering, confident that apologies and charm would smooth over the rough edges, and that confidence frightened Walter more than anger would have. Dinner began with careful politeness. Claire complimented the stew. Martha complained about grocery prices. Daniel talked about Asheville's booming tourism market and how busy downtown had become. Walter mostly listened. The manila folder sat beside his plate, unopened. Daniel's eyes flicked toward it once or twice, but he didn't ask about it. Instead, he filled the silence with stories from work. "You should see the views from the Blue Ridge Summit property," he said, warming to the subject. "On a clear morning, you can see 3 different ridge lines. The rental projections are incredible." Martha kept her eyes on her bowl. Claire's fork moved food around her plate without eating much of it. Walter noticed everything. Daniel continued, seemingly encouraged by the lack of interruption. The investors were nervous for a while, but I think we're finally past the worst of it. Once the financing closes, the first phase could be under construction by spring. Financing. There was that word again. Walter took a slow sip of water. Sounds expensive, he said evenly. Daniel laughed lightly. That's development. You spend money now to make much more later. Then, almost casually, he added, Mom would probably tell me I'm dreaming too big. The room went still. Martha stopped moving entirely. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Walter felt something tighten deep inside him, because Eleanor had told him that. Not playfully, not proudly, fearfully. Daniel seemed not to notice the reaction. He leaned back in his chair, looking around the familiar dining room with a nostalgic smile. You know, he said, when I was a kid, I used to think this house and the store would always stay exactly the same forever. Walter looked at his son carefully. And now? Daniel shrugged. Now I realize you have to adapt or get left behind. The sentence sounded like a business seminar slogan. Walter glanced toward the mantel, where Eleanor's photograph watched over the table. He wondered what she would have heard in that answer. As dinner plates were cleared away, Daniel's confidence seemed to grow. He helped carry dishes to the kitchen, joked with Martha about her overseasoned biscuits, and even offered to stop by the hardware store during the week to help Walter catch up on paperwork. The offer would have sounded thoughtful if Walter hadn't spent the previous week reading loan applications that treated the store as collateral. Claire returned to the table looking pale. She avoided meeting Walter's eyes. Daniel sat back down and folded his hands. Okay, he said with an easy smile. I'm guessing this is the part where we talk about the mysterious business changes. Walter rested his hand on the unopened folder. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Outside, wind rustled the dry autumn leaves across the porch. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell silent again. Ordinary neighborhood sounds, the kind of sounds that continued even when families were about to break apart. Daniel's smile faded slightly as he noticed Walter's expression. Dad, or looked at him for a long moment. He saw the expensive watch, the confident posture, the restless ambition that had once seemed like healthy drive. Then he remembered the empty chair beside his hospital bed, the forged authorization request, the handwritten note about complications, and Eleanor's warning, pay very close attention to the choice he makes. Walter placed both hands on the table to steady himself. His voice, when it came, was calm enough to surprise even him. Tell me something honestly, Daniel. His son nodded slowly. Okay. Walter held his gaze across the table where Eleanor had once served birthday cakes, holiday dinners, and countless ordinary family meals. Where were you? He asked quietly, when the surgeon came out of the operating room and asked for my family? Daniel's confidence vanished so quickly it was almost visible. The easy smile disappeared. Claire's eyes filled with tears before anyone spoke. Martha sat perfectly still at the end of the table, and beside Walter's plate, the unopened manila folder suddenly felt less like paperwork and more like a verdict waiting to be read. The questions settled over the dining room like a sudden drop in temperature. Where were you when the surgeon came out of the operating room and asked for my family? Daniel looked as if someone had pulled the floor out from under him. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old wall clock Eleanor had insisted on keeping even after it became unfashionable. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel cleared his throat. Dad, I already told you, I stepped out for a meeting. Walter's eyes never left his son's face. A meeting, he repeated quietly. Daniel shifted in his chair. The development financing was at a critical stage. I thought the surgery would take hours, and the nurse said they'd call if anything changed. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Walter rested one hand on the manila folder beside his plate. The surgeon came out at 8:46 a.m., he said. He asked for my family because he wasn't sure I was going to survive the operation. Daniel looked down at the table. I didn't know it was that serious. Martha spoke for the first time. Claire called you 3 times. Daniel's jaw tightened. I was in the middle of negotiations. The words hung in the air, and even he seemed to realize how terrible they sounded once spoken aloud. Walter slowly opened the folder. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Inside, the documents were arranged in neat chronological order. He removed the first sheet and slid it across the table. Bank authorization request. Blue Ridge Summit Development, LLC. Amount, $850,000. Submitted Tuesday, 11:42 a.m. Daniel's face lost color immediately. Dad, Walter held up a hand. Read it. Daniel picked up the document. His eyes moved quickly across the page, stopping at the timestamp. This wasn't an actual transfer, he said quickly. It was a preliminary authorization package for the lenders. Walter slid over the second document. Commercial property appraisal, Bennett Hardware and Supply. Then, explain why you had my business and my home appraised without telling me. Daniel looked trapped between defensiveness and panic. I was exploring refinancing options. For whom? Walter asked. No answer. Walter removed another sheet. Blue Ridge Summit collateral worksheet. Highlighted in yellow were the words, Bennett Hardware commercial property to be pledged as secondary security upon owner authorization. Claire's hands began to tremble. Daniel pushed the paper away. It wasn't finalized. Because I was unconscious before you could get my signature. That's not fair. Walter's voice remained calm, which somehow made it more devastating. Fair? He reached deeper into the folder and pulled out the hospital timeline Rebecca had prepared. Tuesday, 7:03 a.m., surgery begins, another page. Tuesday, 8:46 a.m., surgeon requests immediate family, another. Tuesday, 9 p.m., critical condition update left on your voicemail, another. Wednesday, no visit, another. Thursday, no visit. The papers formed a small stack between them, each one another brick in a wall Daniel could no longer talk his way around. Claire finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I told him to stay. Daniel turned toward her sharply. Claire. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. I told you if something happened to him, you'd never forgive yourself. The room went silent again. Walter looked at his son. Not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted sorrow that was far harder to endure. Why didn't you tell me the project was in trouble? He asked quietly. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. The confidence he had carried into the house was completely gone now. Because I thought I could fix it, he admitted. Every time another problem came up, I thought one more deal would solve everything. I didn't want you thinking I'd failed. So you risked my life's work instead. I was trying to save the investment. Walter leaned forward slightly despite the discomfort it caused. Daniel, do you understand what would have happened if Blue Ridge Summit defaulted? Daniel looked away. The store could have been exposed to the lenders, he said reluctantly. The store, the warehouse, my apartment, everything your grandfather and I built. Daniel's silence was answer enough. Martha watched him carefully. Did you ever stop to think about what would happen to your father if he lost all of that? Daniel looked genuinely stricken now. I never thought it would get that far. Walter gave a sad, almost disbelieving smile. That's what people say after they've already crossed the line. He reached into the folder one final time. The remaining envelope was cream-colored, its edges softened by age. Eleanor's handwriting was visible across the front. Daniel frowned. What's that? Walter held the envelope for a moment before answering. This is the document your mother left for me before she died. Daniel's expression changed instantly. Confusion. Concern. Fear. Walter placed the unopened envelope gently in the center of the table between the dirty dinner plates and the scattered financial records. She wrote it months before her cancer took her, he said softly. And after everything I've learned this week, I think it's time you hear what she was trying to warn me about. Daniel stared at the envelope as though it might contain a language he no longer understood. Outside, wind rattled the dry leaves against the porch steps. Inside the Bennett dining room, 4 people sat around a table that had once held birthday cakes, Christmas dinners, and ordinary family conversations. Now it held evidence, silence, and the final words of a woman who had seen the fracture in her family long before anyone else was willing to admit it existed. Walter rested his hand on the envelope, and for the first time that evening, Daniel Bennett looked truly afraid of what was coming next. No one moved. The cream-colored envelope sat in the center of the table like a living thing. Daniel stared at his mother's handwriting, and for the first time since arriving at the house, all the confidence had drained completely from his face. Dad, he began, but Walter shook his head gently. You need to hear this. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter Eleanor had written during the final months of her life. The paper crackled softly in the quiet dining room. Walter looked down at the familiar handwriting, then began to read aloud. My dearest Robert, if you are reading this, then something has happened that forced you to see what I have been afraid to say out loud. Daniel lowered his eyes. Walter continued, his voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. I know you believe Daniel is simply ambitious. I know you think grief has made him restless. But I have watched him become more interested in the value of the building than in the people who live inside it. Claire covered her mouth with one hand. When I was sick, he often talked about expansion plans and investment opportunities while I was trying to hold on to the time we had left together. Daniel looked up sharply. That's not fair, he whispered. I was trying to keep thinking about the future. Walter kept reading. Ambition is not a sin, but ambition without loyalty becomes hunger, and hunger has a way of consuming everything around it. The words hung in the room with devastating clarity. Walter reached the final paragraph and had to pause before continuing. If there ever comes a day when Daniel must choose between protecting you and protecting his financial future, pay very close attention to the choice he makes. Do not excuse it. Do not soften it. You have spent your entire life taking care of other people. Promise me that if the time comes, you will finally take care of yourself. Silence followed. Deep, absolute silence. Daniel stared at the table as if he could no longer bear to look at anyone in the room. Walter folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the stack of financial documents. Your mother wrote that 6 months before she died, he said quietly. Long before my aneurysm. Long before Blue Ridge Summit. Long before I wanted to believe any of this was possible. Daniel's voice cracked when he finally spoke. She thought I was some kind of monster? No, Walter replied immediately. If she thought that, she wouldn't have spent months trying to protect both of us. He reached into the folder again and removed another document. This one was thicker, covered in legal language and notarized seals. Daniel frowned. What is that? Walter looked directly at his son. This is the trust amendment your mother executed before she died. Rebecca Lawson stepped into the dining room at that moment. She had arrived quietly through the kitchen entrance after Martha called her earlier that evening. Daniel's eyes widened. Rebecca, why are you here? Rebecca set her briefcase on the sideboard and spoke with professional calm. Because Eleanor appointed me co-trustee for certain conditional provisions of the Bennett Family Trust. She opened the document to the highlighted section. Your mother added a clause addressing a very specific situation, a life-threatening medical emergency involving your father. Daniel looked confused. What does that have to do with anything? Rebecca read directly from the document. Any inheritance designated for Daniel Robert Bennett shall remain conditional upon the beneficiary demonstrating reasonable care, presence, and support during such emergency as determined by medical and witness records. The color drained from Daniel's face. Claire began crying quietly. Walter watched his son absorb the words, watched the realization spread slowly across his features. No, Daniel said, you can't be serious. Rebecca placed several papers on the table, hospital visitation logs, nursing notes, and the surgical timeline. The records show that you were present before surgery began, she said evenly. You left before the operation was completed and did not return during the 72-hour critical period. Daniel looked from the papers to his father. Dad, listen to me. I made a terrible mistake. I should have stayed. I know that now. Walter's eyes filled with sorrow. I wanted you to prove her wrong, he admitted softly. God help me. I wanted that more than anything. Daniel pushed his chair back abruptly and stood. I was trying to save my business, he burst out. Everything was falling apart. Investors were threatening lawsuits, contractors were demanding money, and I thought if I could just get through that week, I could fix it all. By risking mine? Walter asked. Daniel's shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him all at once. He looked suddenly exhausted, older than his 39 years. I never wanted to hurt you, he said quietly. Walter believed him. That was the tragedy of it. Daniel had not set out to destroy his father. He had simply allowed fear, pride, and desperation to make one selfish decision after another until those decisions formed a path he no longer recognized. Rebecca opened the final document in her briefcase. There is one more matter, she said. Daniel looked at her warily. Pursuant to the activated trust provisions and the protective filings executed during Walter's recovery, Bennett Hardware and Supply has been transferred into the Eleanor Bennett Community Trust. The room seemed to stop breathing. Daniel stared at her. Transferred? The business is now protected by an employee-owned community trust structure. It cannot be pledged as collateral for Blue Ridge Summit development, and operational control no longer passes automatically through the original inheritance provisions. Daniel turned slowly toward his father. You already did it? Walter nodded once. I did. Without even talking to me first? For the first time that evening, a flicker of anger entered Walter's voice. You submitted financing documents using my business accounts while I was unconscious on an operating table. Daniel flinched as if struck. The truth of it was impossible to argue with. Walter's expression softened again, the anger dissolving back into grief. This isn't revenge, son. If it were revenge, I would have stopped at taking the business away. He placed Eleanor's letter gently on top of the trust documents. This is me finally listening to your mother. Daniel sank back into his chair, staring at the papers spread across the table, the forged authorization request, the lender term sheet, the hospital timeline, his mother's warning, and the trust amendment that had quietly been waiting for the very choice he made in the surgical waiting room. Outside, the wind moved through the autumn trees with a soft, rushing sound. Inside the Bennett dining room, Daniel Bennett realized that the most devastating part of the evening was not losing the inheritance. It was discovering that his mother had seen the danger in his choices long before he did, and that his father had finally stopped protecting him from the consequences of becoming the man she feared he was becoming. The next morning, the Bennett house felt unnaturally quiet. Daniel had left shortly after midnight. Not in anger, not with shouting or slammed doors. That would have been easier. He had simply stood in the foyer for a long moment, looking as though he wanted to say something that no longer existed in words. Then he picked up his coat, kissed Claire's forehead mechanically, and walked out into the cold October night without another sentence. Claire remained behind for a few minutes after the front door closed. She stood in the kitchen beside the untouched coffee cups, shoulders trembling. I'm sorry, she whispered. Walter looked at her gently. You didn't do this. I should have stopped it sooner. Maybe, he said honestly. But silence is rarely carried by one person alone. Claire cried then, not only for the inheritance, but for the marriage she suddenly realized had been built on fears and ambitions she had never fully understood. When she finally left, the house returned to silence. Walter sat alone at the dining room table long after midnight, Eleanor's letter still resting beside the empty stew bowls. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt as though someone had amputated a future he had carried in his heart for nearly 40 years. Friday afternoon, against Rebecca's medical objections and Martha's louder objections, Walter insisted on visiting Bennett Hardware. Luis met him at the front door, looking both relieved and worried. You're supposed to be resting, he said. I've been resting for 12 days, Walter replied. That's enough to make any honest man dangerous. The familiar smell of lumber, paint, and machine oil wrapped around him the moment he stepped inside. Customers looked up in surprise. Walter, good to see you back. Heard you gave the doctors a hard time. Warm hands clasped his shoulder. Smiles appeared from every aisle. A contractor near the plumbing section actually applauded, which embarrassed Walter enough that he threatened to charge him extra for copper fittings. As he moved slowly through the store, memories rose from every corner. Eleanor painting the seasonal displays, Daniel stacking boxes of nails during summer vacations, his father teaching him how to greet every customer as if they were walking into your home. Near the back office, several longtime employees had gathered when they heard he was coming. Luis Herrera, Janice Moore from accounting, Tom Wilkins from the lumber yard, Sarah Green from the paint department. People who had given decades of their lives to the business. Walter looked at their faces and felt the truth settle more firmly inside him. This place had never been held together by ownership papers alone. It had been held together by people. I need a few minutes with everyone, he said. They gathered near the contractor counter, confusion spreading through the group. Walter leaned against the counter for support, the effort of standing still, more tiring than he wanted to admit. "I'm not going to make a dramatic speech," he began. "The doctors would probably bill me extra for that." A few nervous laughs broke the tension. He took a slow breath. "Most of you know I had a serious medical emergency. What you may not know is that while I was in the hospital, I spent a lot of time thinking about what happens to this store after I'm gone." The employees exchanged uncertain glances. Walter continued. "For years, I assumed the answer was simple. It would stay in the Bennett family. But surviving something like this forces you to ask a harder question." He looked directly at Luis. "Who actually kept the doors open when I couldn't?" No one spoke. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the brass store key. The metal caught the afternoon light. "My father carried this key before me," he said quietly. "I've carried it for 40 years. The employees watched in complete silence now. Walter held up a folder containing the trust documents. "Rebecca Lawson has finalized the Eleanor Bennett Community Trust. Bennett Hardware will remain locally owned, operated by the people who have devoted their lives to it, and protected from being sold off to outside investors." Janice's eyes widened. Tom let out a low whistle. Luis looked genuinely stunned. "Walter," he began, but the older man raised a hand gently. "This isn't charity," Walter said. "It's recognition." He stepped closer to Luis. 23 years ago, you were a kid who barely knew the difference between a framing hammer and a roofing hammer. You stayed through recessions, supply shortages, floods, and one disastrous inventory system that nearly drove both of us insane." A few employees laughed softly at the memory. Walter extended the brass key. Luis stared at it as if it were far too heavy to touch. "I can't take that." "Yes," Walter said gently. "You can." Luis's hand trembled as he accepted the key. The simple transfer carried more emotion than any legal document could. It was not ownership, it was stewardship. Walter felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "Take care of her," he said softly. "She took care of all of us." Luis nodded, unable to speak. Several employees were openly crying now, including Janice, who made no attempt to hide it. That evening, exhausted from the outing, Walter sat on the back porch wrapped in a blanket while Martha watered the tomato plants. The sky glowed orange behind the mountains. For the first time in days, neither of them spoke about Daniel, lawyers, trusts, or financing. They simply watched the sunset settle over the neighborhood. After a long silence, Martha handed him a small envelope. "This came in the mail this afternoon." Walter recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dad, I don't expect forgiveness, and I know I've lost the right to ask for trust right now." Rebecca explained what Mom did and why. "The hardest part isn't losing the inheritance, it's realizing that somewhere along the way I became someone she was afraid of. I keep replaying Tuesday morning. I told myself I could leave for a few hours because the deal was urgent. I told myself I'd come back before anything important happened. I told myself a lot of things. The truth is that when I was forced to choose between being a son and being a businessman, I chose wrong. I don't know how to fix that yet. But for the first time, I understand what I actually lost." Daniel Walter read the note twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it beside Eleanor's letter in the porch drawer. Martha sat down beside him. "Do you believe him?" she asked quietly. Walter looked out at the darkening mountains. "I believe he finally sees the damage," he said after a long pause. "Whether he changes because of it, that's a different question." The evening air grew cooler. Somewhere downtown, church bells began ringing the hour. Walter rested his hands on the porch railing and realized that the brass key had changed hands. The trust had been signed, and the future of Bennett Hardware no longer depended on the son he once assumed would inherit it. And strangely, for the first time since the aneurysm ruptured, that truth no longer felt like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of a different kind of legacy. 3 weeks later, autumn had settled fully over Asheville. The maple trees along Lexington Avenue burned in shades of red and gold, and a cool wind carried the scent of wood smoke through downtown each evening. Walter Bennett still moved more slowly than before the surgery, but the walker was gone now, replaced by a sturdy wooden cane that Luis jokingly called the boss's management stick. Every afternoon, after a few hours at the hardware store, Walter returned home and sat on the garden bench Eleanor had loved most. The tomatoes were finished for the season. Their vines curled brown and brittle around the stakes, waiting to be pulled up before winter. Eleanor would have done it weeks earlier, muttering that gardeners who procrastinated deserved poor soil. Walter could almost hear her saying it. That evening, the sky was streaked with orange and violet as the sun began to sink behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. From the bench, he could see the glowing Bennett Hardware and Supply sign at the end of the street. The store looked exactly as it always had. But everything had changed. Luis was now managing daily operations under the community trust. Janice had reorganized the accounting system. Tom was training 2 younger employees in the lumber yard. On Saturdays, a small plaque near the entrance announced the new scholarship fund, the Eleanor Bennett Skilled Trades Scholarship, for young people who build with their hands and serve their communities with integrity. Walter had watched a high school student read that plaque earlier that day with quiet curiosity. The sight had filled him with a warmth he had not expected. Martha stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Doctor's orders say 1 cup," she warned. "Then don't tell the doctor about the refill." She laughed softly and sat beside him on the bench. For a while, they watched the neighborhood in comfortable silence. Children rode bicycles down the street. A dog barked at passing squirrels. Somewhere nearby, someone was practicing piano with more enthusiasm than skill. Ordinary life. The kind of life Walter had nearly lost without realizing how precious it was. Martha sipped her coffee. "Luis says the Saturday sales were up 12%. Probably because he finally organized the fastener aisle. You fought that man about the fastener aisle for 20 years. And apparently he was right," Walter admitted with mock bitterness. The laughter faded gently. Martha glanced at him. "Have you heard from Daniel again?" Walter nodded slowly. "A few emails. He's trying to restructure the development project." And Walter looked out toward the mountains. For the first time, the emails sound less like investor presentations and more like a son talking to his father. A week earlier, Daniel had called to ask if they could meet for lunch sometime soon. Not to discuss the trust, not to argue about the inheritance, just lunch. Walter had not answered yet. Healing, he was learning, did not happen on a lawyer's timeline. Martha seemed to understand that without further explanation. The sun dipped lower, bathing the hardware store sign in warm amber light. Walter reached into the small drawer built into the side table beside the bench. Inside were 2 folded letters. Eleanor's warning, Daniel's apology. He kept them together intentionally. One represented fear born from love. The other represented regret born from failure. Both were now part of the same family story. Walter unfolded Eleanor's letter one more time, but he did not read it. He already knew every line by heart. Instead, he looked toward the hardware store and spoke quietly, almost as if Eleanor were sitting beside them. "I spent years worrying about who would inherit the business." Martha listened without interrupting. Walter smiled faintly. "You were wiser than I was, Ellie. The real question wasn't who would own it." He watched Luis lock the front door for the evening and hand a younger employee a set of keys with instructions about opening procedures. Stewardship, not ownership. Walter continued softly, "The real question was who had already inherited our values." The evening breeze rustled the remaining leaves overhead. For the first time since the aneurysm ruptured, Walter felt something close to peace. Not because the pain was gone. It wasn't. His relationship with Daniel remained uncertain, fragile, and unfinished. There would be difficult conversations ahead, and perhaps some wounds would never heal completely. But peace did not come from pretending the betrayal had never happened. It came from knowing that the truth had been faced honestly. The hardware store was safe. The employees who had stood beside him were protected. Eleanor's final act of love had been honored. And Daniel, for the first time in many years, had been forced to confront the difference between success and character. The last edge of the sun slipped behind the mountains. Downtown Asheville began to glow with evening lights, and the illuminated Bennett Hardware and Supply sign shone warmly against the darkening sky. Walter folded both letters carefully and returned them to the drawer. Then he leaned back on the garden bench beside the woman who had stayed when she had nothing to gain, wrapped his hands around the warm coffee mug, and watched the store continue serving the town he loved. In the end, the most valuable thing Walter Bennett passed on was not a building, a bank account, or an inheritance. It was the understanding that real family is revealed not by who expects your legacy, but by who remains beside you when you have nothing left to offer except your presence. And as the porch light flickered on behind them and the mountains disappeared into the quiet blue of evening, Walter realized that surviving surgery had given him one final gift: the chance to leave behind a legacy measured not in property, but in people.